Chapter 14:12. Compared to others, the stagnant realm in Brando's eyes was perhaps more real. The vast ground was a mixture of dark brown and mottled red, like a mottled river of pollution, but more of it was gray, the color of cement and metal. Brendel was certain that he was looking at a city of death. The roads that intertwined like a spider's web occupied his entire field of vision. This was a city that he was extremely familiar with, not only because it contained the characteristics of that era, but more importantly, a black tower stood in the middle of the city, and the entire city's road network was like the veins of a hedgehog's nest. He had seen this tower more than once. But in that dream, the black tower was far from as tall as what he saw now. It might be tens of thousands of feet high. Even from a few kilometers away in the air, he could still feel the oppressive pressure of the tower. The giant tower occupied about a quarter of the entire city. With it as a landmark, the field of vision was enough to extend for thousands of kilometers, but even the horizon was affected. It seemed to be narrowed under the contrast and could not accommodate the suffocating scenery. The entire sky and the ground floated with a gray color, like the waste dust of industrialization, or the silent wasteland after a nuclear war. Everything was killed, there was no movement, not even a trace of wind. Although when observed from outside the stagnant realm, some areas of this land may be engulfed in a perfect sandstorm unimaginable by humans. After Brando passed through the portal, his mind was completely attracted by the giant tower in front of him. He seemed to see every sentence of the dark prophecy flashing in the darkness. 16. The TOWR the lost moon took away the light. XX. JUDGMNT the light lost. 17. The STR the silver generation was lost on the earth, marching forward in the darkness and ignorance. 8. STRNH the encounter of the emperor and the fool. 9. The HRMIT the rusty clockwork was being reset. XXIEWRLD the sword that changed fate. This was a world devoid of life. There was no sun, nor was there a magical moon. However, the entire world was not immersed in darkness. Instead, it reflected a pale gray color. But perhaps complete darkness was better, because darkness could hide the hideous scars. Like now, it gave the illusion of a lifeless corpse lying on a cold bed under the dull light. Brando felt that this was a world that had gone through a trial. Just like the trial described in the Book of Revelation, after the calamity, everything was gone. Whether it was heaven or hell, there was only dead silence left. This was not the wound he knew. Instead, it was more like a world he was familiar with. But no, it wasn't the same. That world was not so big and vast. He raised his head, and his dark brown eyes could not reflect the arc of the planet on the horizon. Moreover, this huge tower. In his memory there was absolutely no such giant tower. Brando had an unreal feeling in his heart. This lifeless city was like a symbolic memory, causing a deeper tremor in the depths of his heart. He actually felt that he had been here before. But there was no relevant memory in his heart at all. Brando suddenly panicked. He felt that the world was calling him. All its laws and powers were in harmony with him. The uncomfortable feeling of being out of place in Vaunt had disappeared. He thought it was the discomfort caused by the other half of his soul. But at this moment he suddenly understood. He should belong here. He should belong to this stagnant world. What is going on? Brando could not help but groan in his heart. What is this place? He closed his eyes. He seemed to see something. It was a blue metal nameplate. The surface was slightly bent. The edges and the oxidized paint were full of red rust. On the nameplate there were convex letters inscribed. Yumsotsruptas Lames 00432408_433W. D. 1044. Stem B 25th. Then these words twisted in front of him and converged into a new noun. Stagnant realm. Silver plains. Teacher. Suddenly, Brando heard someone calling him from the horizon. It seemed to be a familiar voice. Yes, it was Huang Hua, his genius student. Brando finally woke up. All the illusions in front of him disappeared. He saw that Huang Hua and Alaz were fighting with some people. Those people were Fu Luofa's subordinates. He saw Miss Silver Dragon. Her conspicuous black hair was flying in the air. He saw Fang Qi. He was being carried by a tall blue dragon. When he saw this, Brando completely recovered. The holy sword Odorfice appeared in his hand. However, the blue dragon reacted quickly and dodged his flash strike sword art. But it didn't matter. It was just Brando's afterimage that attacked. His body had already moved in another direction. The curved and deformed blade in his hand pointed straight at the blue dragon. The other party cursed angrily. Once again it brushed past Brando's sword. But it did not dare to be careless anymore. It immediately flew back and muttered something in its mouth, intending to cast a string magic. Brando saw an arc of light appear in front of it. It was probably a shield-type spell. But he did not make another move. The blue dragon raised its head strangely. It heard the captive in its hand roar at it contemptuously in Draconic, "You're dead, idiot." Then it was shocked to see that its chest was torn open. In the last sight of the blue dragon, it clearly saw its intact shield spell. It was like a silent taunt, mercilessly mocking its stupidity. Not far away, Fu Luofa watched her companion's head separated from its body. But she only looked at the human captive indifferently for a moment. It was useless. After thinking about this, Fu Luofa turned around and flew down to the city below. Her companions were at a loss. But obviously Miss Silver Dragon was their leader. After hesitating for a moment, the rest of the dragons could only leave unwillingly. Fangchi gasped for air. Brando's swordsmanship had been shown to him more than once. When the former taught Huanghua fighting skills, he often overestimated himself and wanted to challenge him. Then the former's terrifying swordsmanship would be reflected on him. He could not resist at all. This was the conclusion that Fang Qi came to after being beaten so many times. After that, he no longer considered himself a genius. The mistake made by the Blue Dragon was just a repeat of the scene in his second battle. The so-called Golden Clan did not handle it much better than him. In fact, in that battle this was not the most fatal mistake for him. However, the giant reptile was killed before it could even react. Fang Qi finally regained some of his dignity as a genius from these enemies. He once thought that Brando's swordsmanship was the most unaesthetic and the most despicable swordsmanship in the world. But now he found that he began to appreciate it. "Ha! Did you see that the big reptile's dumbfounded expression at the end? It was like a complete idiot." Fang Qi resisted the urge to say those words to Brendel, who had come to receive him. Because at the last moment he suddenly thought that he might be the same at that time. This was simply too humiliating. This genius of Ghost Chariot suddenly felt his face was a little hot. For the first time he felt that he was a teenager in the late stage of Chinibyu, and Brando was more like a mature and steady adult in front of him. Thank you. Brando looked at this guy with some surprise, wondering if he had taken the wrong medicine. But when he saw Fang Qi looking at him with some gratitude, he was sure that this guy must have been scared out of his wits. After the dragons left the battlefield, Phoenix Flame and Alaz also returned to Brando's side. The little female dragon chased after Flora for some distance, but could not catch up. The silver dragon was second only to the blue dragon in terms of speed. The latter was known as the Sky Dragon. It was said that part of its bloodline was of the wind elemental race, and was a distant relative of the wind dragon of the Mountain of Stopped Storms. In terms of flying skills, no one could beat it. Alaz had now returned to her dragon form. It was the first time Brando saw her graceful dragon form. Whether by human or dragon standards, she was a beautiful dragon. However, the little female dragon seemed to be a little angry. She did not allow Brando to look at her, and threatened that if Brando dared to look at her more than twice, she would gouge out his eyeballs and feed them to the pigs. The little female dragon's fierce look was quite intimidating, although Brendel didn't understand why he couldn't see it. Besides, the sisters Ling and Lien were sitting on her back, and they had already seen everything that should be seen. Alaz also did not allow Delphian to sit on her back, so now the Prime Minister's daughter was sitting on Magadol's strange diamond-shaped metal object. When it was not moving, it was very stable. Teacher. Ever since Alaz reverted to her dragon form, she had become incoherent and could not say anything useful. So Phoenix took over her task of reporting to the battlefield. Miss Farofa and the others seemed to be heading towards the tower below. Should we go after them? Chapter 14-13. Everyone turned their attention to the city below. Brando could clearly see the outline of the city, but in the eyes of the others, this strange ruin did not necessarily look like a city. Because it was too different from this city that most of them knew. It had neither walls nor moats. It did not even have any defensive facilities or clear borders. What's more, its scale was too huge. It was so huge that it exceeded the limits of everyone's imagination. Especially in Princess Magadol's eyes, it looked more like a grand temple, or perhaps the kingdom of the gods, the legendary pantheon. When everyone was silent, Mr. Liu added, "Akenta doesn't seem to have appeared either." "Oh right," Fang Qi seemed to have remembered something. "The demon seal has been lifted. You have to be careful. Its power at its peak is not to be underestimated. It doesn't seem like it wants to let us go so easily." Although everyone had already expected this, but now that it was confirmed, they could not help but be speechless. "But why didn't the demon lord stop us here?" Lotus had some doubts. It knew that we would definitely appear here, didn't it? This means that dealing with us may only be its secondary goal. Brando silently glanced at the city below. Its goal may be the same as Miss Furofa's, or it may think that we can't escape. After all, it has just lifted the seal and needs some time to familiarize with its restored power. Maybe it's both, Alas said in a childish voice. It seemed that after turning into a dragon, her voice had become even more childish, even though she had already undergone the rite of adulthood. Demons are a bunch of arrogant fellows. That's the only fact, that we don't hate these fellows who reek of sulfur. It's normal for them to have some presumptuous thoughts sometimes. Brando thought that it was no wonder that the dragons would think this way, because in the eyes of mortals, dragons were also a bunch of arrogant fellows. It was said that during the era of the Four Sages, they reduced the number of times they appeared in the human world, because they did not want to bow down to humans. Alas obviously did not know that this stinking human was secretly criticizing her in his mind. She looked at Brando with her golden eyes and said, "So, hurry up and make a decision, or Furofa and the others will be far away." Brando nodded and said, "Let's go down too." Is the answer to the mystery below? Lotus laid on the back of the golden dragon and stared at the huge city, a faint fear of the unknown in her heart. "Probably," replied her sister, as if she were not much interested in the subject. "I can feel the call of the heart of the Jade Phoenix." Phoenix took a deep breath. "I can feel it, it's below." She turned back and looked at Fang Qi. "Yes, I can feel it too," Fang Qi said after a moment of silence. "It should be our inheritance and the inheritance of the White Raven Sword Arte. Unfortunately, the real inheritance of the White Raven Sword Arte has been destroyed by the Nine Phoenix. The Bai Fang's bloodline is not some random descendant, they are the true inheritors of the White Raven Sword Art." Phoenix frowned and replied. "So what, they even banished the inheritor of the White Raven Sword Art? From that generation, the Bai Fang's bloodline no longer has any true inheritance. That's because he participated in the rebellion, right?" It's meaningless to discuss this from a different standpoint, Fang Qi," Phoenix replied calmly. "The Jade Phoenix's bloodline is just following the heavenly axiom, history will judge everything." "What is the heavenly axiom?" "The heavenly axiom is the people's will, Fang Qi." Fang Qi snorted softly and did not say anything else. Brando naturally heard the argument between the two, but he did not intend to intervene. This was the Nine Phoenix's own business, and it was not up to outsiders to criticize. The others were obviously even less interested. Lotus and Delphian were arguing about what the city below was. The little girl stubbornly believed that it was an ancient ruin, perhaps a holy temple or something similar. The Prime Minister's daughter, on the other hand, pointed out the nature of the city. She believed that this city had many distinct functional areas, and it was obviously a settlement of a civilization. This understanding restored the original identity of a city. The Prime Minister's daughter was unusually talkative. She seemed to be intentionally or unintentionally trying to arouse Magadal's interest in the discussion, so as to distract the Nun Princess's attention. Unfortunately, ever since the Nun Princess entered this world, she seemed to be a little restless. "Mr. Brando," she finally could not help but say, "I have a feeling that I might have been here before, but I don't have any memories of this place. I don't know if it's just my imagination." Brando looked at her, and he too had a lot on his mind. He was even more worried than the Nun Princess. The appearance of this city had cast a shadow over his heart. But at this moment, as the leader, he felt that it was necessary for his team to relax. "It's normal. Andrea told us that this place could be part of the Silver Plains. You were born here, so it's normal for you to have memories of this place." Magadal looked at Brando's eyes uneasily. She seemed to have gained courage from her captain's calm brown eyes. She took a deep breath and calmed down. After all, Brando and the rest could not fly as fast as the dragons. Although he could easily catch up with Flora and the others, the rest of the team did not have the ability to do so. Hence, the team's speed was not fast, and it took about half an hour before they slowly approached the ground. When they were a few hundred meters from the ground, Brando could feel the city's anti-air system. To his surprise, the anti-air system was still working. Even in this dead world, the city's defensive system seemed to be working in an orderly manner. However, the only thing that was still in operation was the no-fly domain. That was a very ancient way of setting up magic, even older than the runic magic of the witches. Needless to say, it was completely incompatible with the structure of modern magic. The biggest difference between ancient magic and modern magic was the way in which dark magic was used. Brando could clearly feel that the laws of this place strictly followed some kind of law, enslaving the dark magic in a way that he had never heard of before, and forming such a large-scale anti-air zone. This scale of anti-air zone was almost impossible to exist in Won's era. Only miraculous ancient magic could reproduce this. However, it wasn't flawless. The tighter the law's control over the dark magic, the greater the feedback from the void. Brando could not imagine how powerful the chaos and dusk as well as the monsters in the wild were in that era. It was no wonder that in the description of the ancient era, the war between the gods and the dusk was so destructive. And there was a big problem with ancient magic, which was that it was too crude. The dark magic was almost unfiltered and absorbed by the law of Tiamat, causing many magic users to go crazy and even fall into darkness. He knew that the ancestors of the Senia were cursed because of using ancient magic, and the witches were another example. It was not until after the Fourth War that the law of Tiamat changed, and the Bugas invented a new magic system. Then Tumen further improved on this system so that the law could be used by mortals, and formed a more advanced and sophisticated modern magic system. Walking in this dusty and dead city, silently feeling the magic in the orbit of the law in a way that he had never experienced before, Brando could not help but have an illusion. It was as if history and the present time were intersecting at this moment, and the stagnant time had been given a new meaning. He looked back at the others, but was disappointed to find that no one else seemed to have the same feeling as him. This is ancient magic. Alaz was a little surprised. There is a complete ancient magic preserved here. If that's the case, this place is really a treasure trove. Many of the knowledge and theories of ancient magic have been lost in our world for a long time. If they can be rediscovered, it will lead to a huge improvement in the modern magic system. That's not all. The nun princess seemed to be familiar with this as well. Ancient magic contains a lot of knowledge from that era. Most of this knowledge has been lost since long ago. Although it may not be completely applicable to us, it can be used to answer many questions that we don't understand now. Scholars who unearth these fragments from the ruins of history have often reaped great rewards, but they are obviously far inferior to this place. This is really a place of miracles. Lotus could not help but praise. I never thought that the wand of the past would be preserved in this stagnant world in such a way. This must be the masterpiece of Lady Martha. This may not be the wand. When Brando heard this sentence suddenly appeared in his mind. Everyone finally landed in the middle of a strange building. These buildings were not similar to the architectural style of any area in Wand. They were neither simple and crude like the human cities, nor were they full of fantasy and romanticism like the Silver Folk. They were not grand like the dragon cities, nor were they delicate and simple like the elven or dwarf cities. Chapter 14:14. Princess Magadal, Huanghua, Fangqi, and even the Prime Minister's daughter looked strange in the eyes of the natives of Wand. The buildings were simple, but they often had complex geometrical shapes, and the surface material was either metal, crystal, or glass. Most of the metal pillars and frames were scorched black and showed signs of melting. Glass and crystals were scattered all over the ground, and the roads in the city were covered in dust, forming a gray world. It was as if the gray sword Saint Mephistopheles had unfolded. But if the buildings were extravagant, they were simple. They did not have the complex and varied lines of the human religious buildings, nor did they have pointed vaults or complicated decorations. They did not have the elves' hollow courtyards, complicated arched windows, pavilions, and gardens. They also did not have the dazzling pillars, stone statues, and carvings of the dwarves. These buildings were simply geometrical shapes and varied planes, simple and powerful, but not lacking in imagination. Everyone was stunned as if they had come to a different world. They did not even notice that their leader seemed to be very familiar with this place. Princess Magadal was studying the ground. The ground was also paved with metal. She gently rubbed it with her finger, and the dull light on the metal became brighter. Mithril! She exclaimed, her eyes filled with shock and disbelief. This discovery caused a stir among the others, because the entire street, or more accurately, most of the buildings in the city were paved with the same metal. A city built with mithril. Everyone's eyes were filled with shock, and of course, there were a few who had a fanatical look in their eyes. Among them were Ling and the little female dragon Alaz. The elder half-elf sister seemed to have come alive at this time. She whispered to her sister, "Is this really mithril, the kind of metal that is very valuable?" "Sister?" Lotus was a little embarrassed by her sister's greedy behavior. "Everyone is watching. Besides, with so much mithril, if we bring it back to our world, it will cause the price of mithril to fluctuate. It may not be as valuable as we think." "What do you know?" the former snorted. "Without money, how are we going to return to Erwin and continue to look for Mother? There is so much mithril here, it won't matter if we take some." As for the price fluctuations, it doesn't matter, we just have to get rid of them before that happens. Brando heard the conversation between the two sisters. It was not that he wanted to eavesdrop, but the two sisters' voices were too loud. He could not help but be surprised by Ling's professional vocabulary. It seemed like this was not the first time the little girl had done such a thing. But when he turned back to look at the latter, the little girl immediately shut her mouth and showed an indifferent expression. But compared to the reserved sisters, Alaz was apparently in a state of fanaticism. So much. Brendel heard her gasp in surprise. She quickly ran to the side and used her teeth to bite the metal pillar. From what he could see, it was a lamp post. This is not mithril. The little female dragon screamed, this is not mithril at all. As a wealth collector, the appraisal of the dragon race, especially the female dragon, caused a commotion. How can it be? Princess Magadol was not surprised. Such a light metal, so hard, and with such good magic conductivity and luminosity, this is obviously mithril. This is not mithril. Alaz was so sad that she was about to cry. Mithril is sweet, this thing doesn't taste right. Brendel, who was observing a building in the distance, almost vomited blood when he heard the little female dragon's words. He thought to himself that this was how the dragon race appraised metals. He could totally imagine that for the dragon race, the higher the value of the metal, the more delicious it would be. So gold was probably chocolate flavored. But he had already recognized the identity of this metal. It was titanium alloy. The whole city used a large number of titanium alloy structures, including the paving of the ground. It was obviously not as simple as a city. Brando had a vague feeling that this thing was more like a fortress. It was too advanced. It was far beyond what he knew of that era. He looked up and stared at the gray sky, but it was as if he saw the bright stars of Wond on a summer night in the mountains of Bucci. That night, he stared at the boundless night sky in the same way and asked himself, what is this? Why did he come to this place? Was it a mission given to him by the unseen world? That made him want to save the country of Erewhon? And at this moment, the answer to this question seemed to be extended to multiple meanings. He had a vague feeling that everything he had been searching for might be answered in this city. He could not help but think, maybe it was not a coincidence that he came here, but a choice in the unseen world. But the question was, who chose him? While Brando was silent, Princess Magadol was obviously interested in the various symbols that appeared on the ground. As a representative public figure of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, she had been to many states under Cruz's rule, including Erewhon, and even the small cities in Silver Bay. There was no street, in any place that was so novel to her. There were all kinds of symbols drawn on the streets. What was the purpose of them? Were they religious symbols? Or was it just an artistic painting? But she saw many repetitive patterns which made her doubt her judgment. The princess looked up and saw Brando walking through a street with ease. She could not help but ask, Mr. Brando, what is the purpose of these symbols? Brendel was thinking about his own problem when he heard Magadol's question. He turned around to look at the direction she was pointing at and answered subconsciously, that's the right-hand lane. What about this? Zebra crossing. Zebra crossing? Brando suddenly reacted, probably I just said it casually. Mr. Brando? I'm sorry, I just felt that the atmosphere was too tense and wanted to make a joke. Faced with Princess Magadol's questioning look, Brando could not help but laugh. It was as if coming to this place, the other half of his soul began to come alive. He was also caught off guard when something like that just now happened. Princess Magadol was stunned. Although she felt that Brando's words were suspicious, she could not find any fault with it. She could not help but think that maybe she was thinking too much. Indeed, the atmosphere here was oppressive, and she could not help but feel suspicious. It was not easy to avoid the nun princess's questioning. Brando finally breathed a sigh of relief. But when he turned back, he saw Alaz, who had returned to her human form, looking at him with a treacherous look. What? This is the fortress of the Silver Plains. It is said to be the birthplace of the Rune Dwarfs. All knowledge about this place is a secret. Even the dragons and bugas have lost information about it. How did you know about it, stinky human? The little female dragon was still holding half of the lamp post in her hand, and said with a proud tone, did you find it in some mage's pile of papers? I said it was just a casual remark. Brando replied in a huff, what are you doing with that lamp post? Are you planning to use it as a weapon? This is a lamp post? The little female dragon looked at him ambiguously. I see, I just wanted to take it back to the dragons to see if it was valuable. Its physical properties are similar to mithril, and it also has a good magic conductivity. In theory it should not be a simple metal. I just thought it looked like it. Hee, unnecessary explanation, stinky human. Shut up. Brando and Alaz continued to pester each other. Fortunately, the little female dragon did not seem to intend to continue on this topic, and was just proud of her own judgment. Not long after, Huang Hua and Fang Qi found the traces left behind by Fu Luofa and the others. It was a tall building, much taller and more majestic than any human building in Wonde. In fact, before seeing such a city, it was hard for others to believe that there was a place in the world where buildings could be built so tall and straight. Of course, some of them may have seen the World Tree of Valhalla, and the towering fortress was still fresh in their minds. However, compared to the mountain-like tower in the center of the city, the World Tree of Valhalla was nothing. And on the building discovered by Huang Hua, Brando saw the corpse of a giant dragon. The latter was in the form of a dragon crawling on the top of the building, with a huge spear on its back. The spear nailed it to the glass and titanium alloy structure of the building. Its head was tilted to one side, and it was obvious that it had been dead for a long time. This spear, Magadol stared at the dark red spear and said solemnly, "This is the lava spear, the weapon of a high-grade demon. This is the first time I've seen it in real life. Strange, why would they fight with us?" "Don't underestimate the madness of a demon," Alaz replied, gritting her teeth. "It must be trying to take the spoils of war for itself, or to please the Twilight Dragon. Damn it, Fu Luofa is in danger." As she said that, she wanted to chase in that direction. But before she could do so, Brando pressed on her shoulder. "Wait, something's not right here." Brando looked around solemnly and warned in a low voice. Just as his voice trailed off, the quiet street was filled with a rustling sound, as if countless insects were crawling on the ground, surrounding them from all directions. Chapter 14-15. On the dark and deep street, the sudden sound of metal scraping on the ground made one's scalp tingle, especially when the sound was like dense raindrops hitting one's eardrums. Lotus suddenly screamed, "Look, what is that?" Brendel looked back and saw the girl with a pair of oversized glasses covering her mouth, pointing to a spot not far away with a horrified expression. There was a collapsed building in that direction. The huge metal structure was blown apart from the inside, and the metal wreckage and glass shards piled up like a mountain, covering a crossroad. The ruins were covered with dust, as if it had been buried in the long river of history. At this moment, countless beetle-like creatures were pouring out from the ruins, like a black stream rushing towards them. These beetles were about the size of a football and looked like Coleoptera beetles. Their keratinized wings were covered with dark red veins, and a pair of compound eyes flashed with a dim red light in the dark. But the most eye-catching thing was their huge mouthparts, which were more than a foot long, like a pair of sharp blades. When they were discovered, hundreds of thousands of beetles spread their wings, and a sharp whistle sounded as if the air was ignited. A black wall suddenly rose up in front of everyone's eyes, and a black storm rained down on them. "Beetle larvae!" Allah screamed. Brando stepped out from the crowd, and pointed the tip of his sword in the direction of the beetles. The tip of the sword shone with a dazzling light, and a layer of translucent hexagonal network fell from the sky. The beetles immediately hit the network like raindrops and fell to the ground. He looked back and shouted to everyone with a serious face, "Run!" Everyone looked around and found that the disgusting creatures were everywhere, and their numbers were uncountable. The squeaking sound was the sound of the beetles crawling on the metal ground. "We are surrounded, Mr. Brando," Princess Magadol shouted anxiously. Brando took a deep breath and felt guilty for his negligence. The city attracted too much of his attention, and he did not notice the threat close at hand. However, these horseshoe mites were not simply hiding. Otherwise, his darkness perception would have warned him long ago. He closed his eyes. Everyone heard a soft buzzing sound, and a layer of black ripples swept out in all directions with Brendel as the center. It was as if there was a visible airflow that made everyone's robes flutter. When Phoenix Fire turned around, her emerald eyes reflected the scene of thousands of locusts being swept away by the black ripples. The swarm of locusts formed a white ripple, and from afar, this ripple was spreading at a speed faster than the speed of sound from the front to the back of the swarm. Phoenix saw this scene and her eyes were filled with horror. She murmured, "Calm ancient well, the realm of oneness of heaven and man. This is the materialization of the power of the soul. Teacher." She turned around and saw that Fang Qi was looking in that direction with admiration. The latter noticed her gaze and turned back, his dark eyes shining. "This is what I'm after, the ultimate power." "Me too." Phoenix clenched her fists. Brendel used darkness perception and Heaven's Eyes power to scan dozens of streets in an instant. Everything within a few kilometers seemed to be under his observation, and he saw everything. Then he understood the source of these horseshoe mites. The beetles did not appear out of thin air. Brando tilted his head. Alas, do you see the building over there? His eyes fell on the building where the brimstone spear was. I see it. Can you find a way to open a passage? The little female dragon looked at the swarm and frowned. Tisk, it's a little difficult. Miss Magadal, is it okay for you to do it? Me? Magadal asked nervously. Yes, you can try. Then? Okay, I'll try, Mr. Brando. Magadal sighed softly and stepped forward. She looked up. Although her face was still pale due to her nervousness, she looked at the beetles with a calm gaze. She held the Book of Gaia in her left hand and placed it across her right palm. The magic in the air became active, and dozens of beetles let out a sharp cry. They spread their wings and flew towards them like cannonballs. Allah's cover Miss Magadal. I know. The little female dragon's eyes shone brightly. It was these damned insects that caused her and Flora to be separated. Now she wanted them to pay a little compensation. She looked up and gently opened her hands to the side. She took a deep breath and even her small chest seemed to swell. Aluo opened her mouth wide, revealing her white fangs. Finally, she sneered at the bugs in front of her from the corner of her eye. It was as if she was looking at a pile of corpses. What followed was a roar from the vast expanse. Roar, the dragon's roar swept across, and the harsh sound waves caused the lines of law in her field of vision to vibrate at a frequency visible to the naked eye. Silver lines spread out in all directions, and as they vibrated, they formed sharp peaks and valleys. Wherever they passed, the wind howled and sparks flew from the metal floor. The fire borrowed the strength of the wind, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into a sea of fire, engulfing the beetles that flew towards them. Alaz opened her mouth wide, and an endless roar burst out from her small chest, forming a storm in the blink of an eye. The horseshoe beetles lowered their bodies under this terrible power, hooking their 6 legs tightly to the ground, as if the slightest mistake would blow them away. At this time, Magadal's right palm drew a 120-degree arc in the air, and finally landed gently in front of her. It was a blade. Countless silver lines flashed in the air. With a loud bang, half of the street seemed to have been sunk by this blade. The streets on both sides collapsed towards the center, and the low, deep sound of metal breaking echoed in the air. Thousands of locusts were reduced to ashes by this attack. Everyone was dumbfounded. Although Magadal had shown greater power on the previous battlefield, but in the smoke-filled battlefield, it was not as direct as this scene. Andrea had claimed more than once that Magadal was the 13th daughter of Gaia, a real titan. And at this moment, they finally believed that this elegant and cultured princess was a descendant of the titans. This power. Lotus could not help but widen her eyes and gasped, Miss Magadal is also so powerful. That is not Miss Magadal's power. Phoenix Flame shook her head gently and looked up at the city with some respect. This is the power of Tiamat. The little female dragon finally stopped roaring. She replied excitedly, this is the battle style of the divine people. After tens of thousands of years, there is finally someone who can fully display the power of Lady Martha again. Although it's not complete, it already has the grandeur of the past. I've finally seen it. This is a power that even Lady Oenlos and the previous king have never seen before. It's the network of the divine people. Network? Legend has it that with the help of Lady Martha, the divine people weaved a large net in this world. Everything comes from this original network. That is the first generation of the net of law, that is the source of the divine people's power. In this network, anyone can become a god. They are omnipotent. But they still can't defeat the Twilight Dragon, right? Lotus looked up at the dragon girl who was only half a head taller than her. Yes, but can we defeat the Twilight Dragon? Alas could not help but look confused. Her gaze involuntarily fell on Brendel, who was not far away. Brando pointed at the building not far away and shouted to everyone, leave this place immediately, go inside quick now, save time. Where did these beetles come from? The little fairy Lute flew to Brendel's side during the evacuation and asked. They were brought in from the outside. I just saw a few craters and they all came from the nearby tunnels. Obviously there were eggs that fell into those places. Brando pointed to the sky, they came from there. Who brought them, a Kentu? It is possible, but it is more likely that they were originally sealed together with a Kentu, and when the seal was broken they came to this world. How is that possible? Lute shouted in surprise. There is such a possibility, if these insects were together with the demons and were an advance army. When they tried to invade the stagnation realm, they were ambushed by the ancestors of the Bugas, and as a result, were forever sealed outside the stagnation realm, until today when they saw the light of day again. Brando maintained the wall of law behind him, while looking at the possible threats on both sides of the street. Magadal's attack just now almost eliminated all the threats in this direction. In that case, why didn't the ancestors of the Bugas kill them in one fell swoop? Why did they make such a troublesome and dangerous thing like sealing them? Lute was puzzled. Could it be that they didn't foresee the situation today? Of course they could foresee it, but what if they had to do it? For example, it was beyond their ability, or, at that time, the ancestors of the Bugas did not have enough time to complete all of this. Chapter 14:16. No time? At the most crucial moment of the war, they don't have the time to stay here, Brando replied in a low voice as the pieces of the puzzle in his mind became clearer and more complete. Perhaps there is another more important battle that they need to participate in. That is, Brendel shook his head and did not say anything. He still lacked some crucial evidence in his mind, and before that he did not want to discuss too many guesses. That would only lead to subjective misunderstandings of his and the other's judgment. At this time, the two of them passed by the nun princess who was panting slightly. Brando could not help but encourage her. "Well done, Miss Magadal. You have saved all of us once." Magadal was at a loss as she tidied up her skirt. Her hands were still trembling slightly as the continuous battles had taken a toll on her. However, her pale face could not help but reveal a trace of surprise. "Really?" "Of course." Alaz proudly gave her a thumbs up. The nun princess was finally relieved as she placed her hand on her chest and quietly let out a sigh of relief. The group followed the path that Magadal had opened up, and it did not take long for them to pass through the broken and smoke-filled streets and enter the building. The swarm of insects quickly followed, but the nun princess used the Book of Gaia to raise the street level and block the entrance, temporarily blocking the insects from entering. The surroundings darkened, and even the rustling sounds outside became soft. The group felt that they had walked into an empty and dark hall. The entire space was silent in the darkness. Brando chanted, "Flame." A ball of flame rose from his hand, and the flickering light reflected a spacious, empty, and dusty world. Not far away was a platform, and on the dusty metal surface was a huge crystal plate with complicated lines and patterns. Brando raised the ball of flame in his hand and lit up every corner of the crystal plate. He looked up and carefully observed the complicated lines and patterns on the plate. "What is this?" Alaz asked. "A map." "A map? It's about the map of this area," Brando replied. "I think I understand why Flora and Akenta came here." "You can understand it?" The little female dragon looked at Brando in surprise. Brando shook his head. There were two ancient characters on it. He had never seen them before, but he seemed to be able to recognize their meaning at a glance. This was a classic case of self-awakening. Such a phenomenon would only occur when a bloodline was passed down, such as the giant dragons. Mortals had to acquire knowledge through learning. However, Brando's family history wasn't complicated. Although his grandfather was powerful, he was still a pure Erewhon. His grandmother's background was similar to his mother's. Both of them were nobles of Kaliga. His father was also of Highlander blood, and so was he. His grandfather had a few brothers and sisters, but there were no abnormalities in their descendants. His father had never heard of such a thing. Moreover, if the bloodline inheritance could not be purified, it would disappear within a few generations. Therefore, there was no point in investigating the history of the family for a longer period of time. Another possibility was that he had lost a certain memory. In that lost memory he might have come to this place and systematically learned these two languages. But this was unlikely. The time didn't match. Brando's identity was only 22 years old today. "This is a layout map of magic transmission," he replied. "The black tower we saw outside is the center of this city. It controls the magic of the entire city and transmits magic to all parts of the city through relay stations. This is one of the relay stations. So Akenta must want to get a map of this area from here. What is it looking for?" "A laboratory." Brando's gaze fell on the upper right corner of the crystal plate, where 3 letters were marked, R.T.U. There were obvious traces of dust being wiped away. When Magadal saw the letters, her body shook visibly. Delphian quickly supported her. "Is that where Miss Magadal was born?" The others had obviously heard about the history of the 13 Titans from Andrea. Phoenixwa glanced at the crystal plate and asked, "What, Sister Magadal was born in this place?" But this was the first time Lotus knew of this secret. She couldn't help but widen her eyes behind her thick glasses. Then she's not a resident here? That was a story from a long time ago, little one, Fangchi replied. That lady is not as simple as she seems. The two little girls remembered the power that the nun princess displayed and couldn't help but look at her in awe. They obediently kept quiet. The devils are looking for the secret of the creators? Alaz asked in surprise. The creators used the planeswalker system to create substitutes. Perhaps the Twilight Dragon wanted to find the source of the planeswalker's power. The Twilight Dragon claimed that it wanted to completely grasp the secrets of our world. Since Wand was created for the divine people, the power of the planeswalkers might be the source of this world, Brando replied. I'm afraid that may not be the case, my lord. Delphine, who had been silent all this while, finally spoke. I remember Andrea saying that the demons have invaded the Silver Plains more than once. In several wars, the Silver Plains was even torn apart because of this. The 12 titans died one after another, and Princess Magadal, the last creator, was also left behind in Vaunt. During this process, the minions of the Twilight Dragon had plenty of opportunities to get close to the creators. Moreover, in the Moon's Channel, Akenta should have recognized Miss Magadal's identity. But after it escaped, it didn't attack us immediately. Instead, it went to Miss Flofa and the others. What does this mean? It means that Akenta didn't care about the creators, even if Magadal was the 13th creator. His goal was the 17th laboratory itself, or this secret that still exists in the laboratory. Brando looked at the scratches on the crystal plate and revealed a look of understanding. And the landing point of the nightmare worm eggs was nearby, which means that Akenta's landing point wasn't too far away. Since it clashed with the dragons here, it means that Miss Flofa and the others weren't slow. This means that Akentu and the dragons came here one after another. Obviously, they are more familiar with this place than we are, and they know where their destination is. From this point of view, we are far behind them. We still have no clue what we are looking for. Then what should we do? Alaz asked. Should we stop them? Of course we have to stop them. If the secret that the Twilight Dragon is so eager to find is related to the survival of our world, Magadal replied firmly. Otherwise, even if Mr. Brando finds the orb of nature, what's the point? The others were silent for a moment. They had to agree that this opinion was hard to ignore. But those worms have already surrounded this place, not to mention that they left before us, Phoenix Hua asked. Can we still make it in time? Yes. Brendel's answer was resolute and decisive. The others couldn't help but look at him curiously, not understanding where Brando's confidence came from. Brendel replied faintly, that's right. Akenta may know very well where his destination is and how he should get there. But it will never understand what the legacy of civilization is. Under the puzzled gazes of the others, Brando silently came to the side of the crystal plate. He gently rubbed the center of the plate with his hand and drew a small mark there. Underground Transmission Tunnel, Number 14 Magic Relay Center Transmission Station. With a loud bang, the alloy door that was half a meter thick was smashed open by the huge impact and twisted into a ball. 3 panicked figures entered the door one after another and arrived at the underground space behind the door. One of them couldn't help but kneel on the ground after 2 steps and coughed heavily. She turned around with a pale face. She pressed one hand on her chest, and golden blood kept oozing out from between her fingers. Drops of blood dripped onto the ground and shone in the darkness, forming a pearl-like trail of light. She was also injured, but she still didn't say a word. She only looked at her companions with a cold face. The silver dragon shook its head weakly, indicating that it couldn't walk anymore and that they should leave quickly. She frowned and was about to speak, but at this moment, her expression suddenly changed and she subconsciously took 2 steps back. A huge claw appeared on the alloy door. The claw tore the door left and right like a piece of paper, tearing the door to shreds. The alloy door let out a low whimper and completely split into 2. Then it was casually thrown aside like trash and fell heavily on the ground. Behind the giant door, the figure of a tall demon appeared. Akenta arrogantly looked at the 3 remaining dragons and slowly walked into the underground space. Not running anymore? It opened its mouth and sneered, revealing its white fangs. Akentu. Despair flashed in Furofa's eyes. She let out an angry roar and rushed toward the Lord of Purgatory. Chapter 14:17. Akenta's eyes showed a look of indifference. It pointed at Fu Luofa with its right index finger. Fu Luofa suddenly let out a cry and fell from the air. She fell heavily on the ground and could no longer get up. Akenta then pointed at the remaining dragon. The dragon screamed and flew backward, hitting a metal pillar not far away. Akenta looked down at the 3 defeated soldiers with a sneer on its face. Akentu, Fu Luofa lay on the ground with her face covered in blood. She gently breathed, but her expression did not change. Only her voice was as cold as ice. You have killed many of my companions. Do you really want to fight to the death with us, even at the expense of affecting Master's plan? Don't forget that we have a common enemy. They have also entered this world. Akenta raised its head and its horns high, looking a little arrogant. In its view, this cat-and-mouse game was just revenge for the damn reptiles' disrespect to it at the beginning. It felt that it was necessary to let these reptiles know who was the most capable assistant of its master, and not the unreliable traders who had temporarily turned to its master. It did not immediately answer Fu Luofa's question. Instead, it silently looked around the underground space. Demons could easily see through the darkness and capture even the faintest light in the darkness. In its view, this dark underground space was as bright as noon. This was an open hall, but it looked more like a workshop. There were rows of metal platforms in the hall, and further away there was a row of metal culture tanks. There were a total of 12. In the position of the 13th, the metal culture tank that was originally placed there had been removed and was empty. Akenta raised its head and looked at the ceiling in the center of the hall. There was a huge symbol of the Twilight and Order dragon surrounding Wond. It was the symbol of the Gaia organization. After seeing this, it lowered its head and looked at Fu Luofa and the others again. Little girl, are you afraid? Akenta said in a triumphant tone. Previously you just paid the price for your rudeness. I just want you to understand that necessary courtesy is very important, especially in front of a true powerhouse. It may save your life, but of course it may also take your life just like now. Fu Luofa's face was dark, but she did not say a word. She knew that this time she had failed. In the face of absolute strength, any strategy would not work. Not to mention when it came to conspiracy, they might not be the opponent of this cunning demon in front of them. As for Fu Luofa's previous threat, Akenta seemed to be somewhat disdainful. Common enemy? You mean those pitiful humans outside? I'm afraid that they are still struggling in the sea of reptiles. I hope that they can live longer. After all, I still have a debt to settle with them. Fu Luofa's voice. Fu Luofa. You will regret it, Fu Luofa said indifferently. Her words seemed to have affected her wound, making her cough lightly. Akenta nodded. There is a 13th Titan beside that human. Perhaps he is indeed a unique little guy. But so what? The greater demon opened its hand and said loudly. Everything is in my plan. I have been waiting for this moment for thousands of years. Now Master's great plan will be completed by me. And you? Akenta looked down at Fu Luofa and the other 2 and sneered. You are lucky enough to witness how I complete all of this. Your foolish loyalty is not worth mentioning compared to it. Do you really think that Master sent you to complete this plan? Master only sent me the key to open the door. As keys, you should learn to be self-aware after completing your mission. It's a pity. It shook its head and sighed. You are too stupid. You don't understand the subtle meaning of wisdom. As it said that, the greater demon slowly walked to the center of the hall. Fu Luofa frowned. Just as she was puzzled by its strange actions, the greater demon raised its chin and shouted. Come out, Gaia. I know you are here. The so-called Mother Earth, how long do you want to hide? Are you waiting for me to completely raze this place to the ground? The Lord of Purgatory's arrogant roar reverberated in the hall. Fu Luofa and the others couldn't help but frown. Suddenly the hall became slightly brighter. A gentle voice sounded from the darkness. Kenta, we meet again. After 10,000 years, 234 days, 17 hours, 23 minutes and 55 seconds, I noticed that your body's functions have declined a lot. This means that the power of the demons is gradually fading. As I expected, the power of dusk is declining due to the deterioration of the world's power level. Akenta narrowed his eyes and looked at the light that suddenly rose in the center of the hall. It was a pure ball of light. In the center of the ball of light, a gentle stream of light flowed like a stream of water. It was like a ray of light that was born in ancient times. Everyone in the hall, including Fu Luofa, couldn't help but be shocked. The mission given to them by their master was to bring back the core secret of Stagnation Realm. Just as Akenta said, they only knew that the secret was buried under the laboratory, but no one knew that there was a god here. Mother Earth, Gaia. Don't pretend to be mysterious, Akenta snorted. I'm not here to talk nonsense with you, Gaia. Perhaps your plan was very precise, and the attack of the Bugas that day was completely beyond our expectations. But unfortunately, all was for naught. You ultimately failed. thousands of years later I still came here. You may not have expected it, but it was the mortals that you placed high hopes on that helped me complete all of this. It was my mortal servants who opened the channel of the moons, and another group of mortals who unlocked my seal. So, do you feel that fate is playing you? Akentu, it's meaningless. No matter how much you do, you can't redeem all of this. With the advent of the mortal era, the defeat of the Dusk Dragon is inevitable. This war that has lasted for 6 eras will completely end here. I can't see that those pathetic vermin have the ability to do so. Akentu grinned ferociously. On the contrary, the Great Master has obtained the only pure-blooded ancestor. You have even lost the user of the key. And I'm here to completely cut off all hope for you. Perhaps you're right about one thing, Gaia. The Lord of Purgatory's face was full of fanaticism. The War of 6 eras will completely end here. This time, you can no longer escape the judgment of the Master by rebooting this world. So now tell me, where is the Throne of Destiny? The light ball flickered for a moment. Do you really want to see the Throne of Destiny, Akentu? The gentle voice said. Perhaps when you see the ultimate face of this plan, it will be too late for you to regret. Akentu let out a long laugh. Are these your empty threats, Gaia? How laughable. When did Martha and her gods fall to such a state? Do you think I'll retreat? I can't think of anything here that can stop me. Is it the gods or the titans? I won't stop you, Akentu. You'll see it soon. The Lord of Purgatory was slightly stunned. He knew that Martha's Tiamat code had an unprecedented highest authority behind it. This authority had only been used a few times in the past eras, but each time, it had allowed this world to escape the final fate of the Twilight. In the 5th and 6th War, the Twilight Dragon had not hesitated to project its true body into this world in order to steal this highest authority itself. This authority was so important, whether it was to its great master or the gods of Wond, because at this moment, it was almost the final hammer that determined the final outcome of this war. But why was the other party so indifferent about it? At that moment, Akentu had a moment of hesitation. But he quickly threw this hesitation to the back of his mind. At this critical moment, he would never retreat because of a little bit of empty threats, and the great existence behind him would never allow it. Thinking of this, the Lord of Purgatory quickly became cold and resolute. Its scarlet-red eyes turned back to yellow, and a cruel and cunning light flickered in its eyes as it coldly replied, "Yes, Lord of Purgatory." He said coldly, "I hope you're not stupid enough to play any tricks, Gaia. What is this place?" Just as Allah suspected that this underground tunnel that seemed to extend infinitely in both directions had no end, the light of the flame in Brando's hand suddenly spread out along the walls on both sides of the tunnel to the left and right, and finally formed a huge underground hall. Allah was very familiar with the structure of this hall. Because when they were underground in the magic relay station, they set off from such a hall, and then followed this underground tunnel full of metal tracks and pipes for almost a quarter of an hour before arriving at this place. The hall was very grand, and there were at least 7 or 8 tunnels intersecting here. The metal tracks overlapped with each other, but at the intersection, there seemed to be some kind of mechanism that could change the tracks. Almost everyone was curious about these things, but Delphian had seen magic cars in Hazel before. The Hazel people used magic-powered cars to transport or on the tracks, and that kind of track was almost the same as these metal tracks, but much shorter and narrower, and was usually only used in mines. Are we back to the starting point again? Seeing this scene, Fang Qi could not help but frown in doubt. Obviously not. The little female dragon observed very carefully. The furnishings on the platform are different, and there are many more converging tunnels here. I understand, the ground here must be similar to the previous magic relay station. Brando was very surprised by the little female dragon's ability to draw inferences. He looked at her with some surprise and replied, "That's a station, not a platform." He raised the flame in his hand and looked carefully at the sign in the hall. After seeing the words on it, he nodded. "We're here." Chapter 14:18. "Mr. Brando, come and take a look at this." Magadal's voice came from the side. Brendel moved the flame in his hand towards that direction, and the light seemed to have a shape in the darkness. In the pale and narrow space, it reflected a huge door that was twisted to the side. Its alloy material was easily torn apart like paper. Brando saw the fresh claw marks on the door and knew that either Flora or Akentu had passed by here not long ago. Unless there was a third party, this meant that they had found the right place. "Look at the ground." Huang Ho pointed at the bloodstains on the ground. The dried bloodstains glittered like gold in the pale light. "This is dragon blood." Alaz was anxious and wanted to rush behind the door. But Brendel grabbed her by the shoulder, pulled out the holy sword Odorfice with one hand, and walked in ahead of her. Behind the twisted alloy door was the underground hall where Akentu and Flora had a conflict not long ago. As soon as Brando entered the empty hall, he raised the flame in his hand and let the pale light spread in all directions. He only needed to look at the furnishings to know that they had entered the core area of the laboratory. His gaze fell on the metal culture tanks leaning against the wall, and then turned to look at Magadol behind him. The nun princess let out a low cry when she saw this scene. Her face turned pale, and her whole body swayed and fell backwards. If it was not for Brando who caught her in time, the Princess of Antoinette would have fallen to the ground. "Miss Magadol, what did you remember?" Brendel asked in a low voice. Magadol's lips trembled slightly. "I think I have been here before. You're actually very afraid that what your grandfather said is true." Brendel let go of her hand. "You don't believe what Andrea told you. In your heart, you still want to be the nun princess of Antiburo. That's all. You want to go back to those days, right?" Magadol's face was a little pale. She placed her hand on her chest and lowered her head in pain. "I'm scared, I'm really scared. Mr. Brendel, there's another me living in my heart. I'm so scared. If I remember my past, I'll lose everything." She suddenly covered her face and sobbed. "Mr. Brando, I think I am so selfish. She gave me life, but I am so afraid of her." The sudden sound of a young girl crying in the darkness made everyone stop. Even Alaz, who was most anxious for her partner, could not help but stop and look at the nun princess. No one had ever seen the usually quiet and gentle princess cry so hysterically. Even Lotus and Huang Hua were at a loss for what to do with this sudden change. Brando also looked at her. Looking at this lady, he could not help but think of Marshal Brando's request. After all, he was Magadol's grandfather. Although he was only a figurehead, Marshal Brando was the only one who could see the confusion and avoidance in his granddaughter's heart. Perhaps he had already seen through it. Instead of letting this secret be buried in her heart forever, it would be better for her to face the truth. Perhaps it was a little cruel, but at least it would give her a chance to let go of the knot in her heart forever. Perhaps no one in this world would know what the nun princess saw on her last trip to the Silver Plains. Instead of trying to find an answer by beating around the bush, why not come to this world again? Andrea's suggestion was not without reason. Brando silently walked over and grabbed Princess Magadol's arm, taking her hand away from her face. "She gave you life and let you replace her, to complete her unfinished business. Perhaps she did not want you to appear so weak, Miss Magadol?" Magadol raised her head and looked at him with tear-stained eyes. Brando looked at her eyes that were as clear as the sea and comforted her gently. "Don't be afraid, Miss Magadol. You are yourself. You will always hold on to your ideals, beliefs and feelings. That's why it is so real. We will say that you are Princess Griffin's good friend, the nun princess of Antiburo. You are Marshal Brando's granddaughter, Magadol Antiburo Lopez. But is that important? Because no matter where you come from, no matter who you are, at this moment, you are with us, standing side by side. We will face the dangers and the future together. The symbol and meaning of our names and identities may not depend on who and what they are, but on who and what we mean to others." "Others?" Brando nodded and then asked, "So, our trusted friend Miss Magadol, have you regained your courage?" Magadol slowly blinked, her eyes were as bright and beautiful as crystals. She looked at the others in confusion. Lotus, who was not far away, adjusted her glasses that were about to fall off the bridge of her nose, and hurriedly raised her fist and said, "Miss Magadol, Mr. Brando is right. You are the best. Have you forgotten about the battle just now? Actually, the most important thing is that you are the most charming," Fong Chi added. He glanced at the Prime Minister's daughter and was kicked by Alaz. Magadol let out a sigh of relief. She looked at the rows of metal culture tanks on the wall. There were a total of 12 of them. This cold scene was so familiar to her, but at this moment she no longer felt the suffocating fear. "This is the place where I was born." She thought to herself, "How nice. Being able to live in this world is such a great thing." Magadol quietly raised her head, and saw that Brando's gaze was still on her. She suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of panic. Brando did not have such complicated thoughts in his mind. He asked, "Miss Magadol, do you remember everything about this place?" Magadol hurriedly replied, "Yes, Mr. Brando. The moment I entered here, many memories appeared in my mind." "Is there anything that scares you?" Magadol frowned and she pressed her forehead and said, I remember that I have been to a similar place before and I saw something. What? I don't know. I feel that my mind is in a mess and I am very scared. I think, maybe she is affecting me? You have been here before. After you were born, you found your own culture tank and tried to remove a nameplate from it. Brando replied, in that adventure you saw something. That encounter caused you to be seriously injured, and not long after you returned to Antoine you died. After that, it is the history that we are familiar with. Then what is here that is enough to threaten you? Have you been to this stagnant realm before? Miss Magadol, do you remember what happened in between? Brendel suddenly asked, not giving her any face. No, I didn't. Beads of sweat appeared on Magadol's forehead. She had just calmed down a little, but now she was starting to feel uneasy again. She replied nervously, I don't know. For a moment I seem to remember something. What is it? Brando saw that Magadol's face had turned pale again. Her eyes widened, and her pupils dilated slightly due to uneasiness. Everyone else had already entered the hall, but Ling and Lotus were still beside Brando. The little girl saw this scene and was slightly puzzled. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but was stopped by Huanghua. Huanghua, Mr. Brando, Huanghua looked at Lotus and shook her head gently. Believe in Master. Princess Magadol clenched her fists. At this moment, Mr. Brando became a little detestable in her eyes. She clearly did not want to recall all of this, but the memories hidden in her heart were like an invisible hand, clutching her heart, suffocating her and making her feel as if she would die in the next moment. Her heart was thumping wildly. Did you see a black tower? But at this moment, Brando suddenly asked. The nun princess looked as if she was struck by lightning, and her mouth was wide open in shock. It was as if with Brando's words, countless memories trickled into her heart like a trickle, and those blurry memories suddenly became clear. But Brando did not care about the princess's reaction and continued, you saw a ray of light, and that light predicted a future for you. The whole world fell into darkness, and a huge moon hung alone in the sky of the whole world. There was no light, no life, and everything was dead. You saw the back of the world, and there was a supreme authority, and there were many people wearing purple and golden robes, and they passed by you. You saw a setting sun and countless meteors falling from the sky. You see a tower falling from the clouds. Flames are burning fiercely, and there is only a dazzling green light shining in the clouds. You saw the dusk of the whole world, as if the prophecy of Won's destruction was right in front of you. Brando's voice softened. Am I right? Chapter 14:19. Bull. Mr. Brando, how did you know? Magadol looked at the man in front of her as if she had seen a ghost. She was so weak that she could faint at any moment. Brando did not speak. Perhaps all of this is not your imagination. After a while, he slowly opened his mouth and said, perhaps it is your real experience. You have seen all of this with your own eyes, and it formed a memory that is buried in the depths of your heart. Perhaps someone purposely buried all of this. Boo. Mr. Brando, are you really the Dark Dragon? Princess Magadol was speechless for a long time. After a while she asked in a daze, what the witches said is true. You are the one mentioned in the dark prophecy, the one who came to this world, the one who knows everything, the one who will destroy everything, and the one who will save the world? Brando let out a long sigh. I am not. He removed the flame on his palm and replied faintly in the darkness. Miss Magadol, it is best for you to recall who attacked you. After saying that, Brando turned his gaze to the other side of the laboratory. The darkness couldn't obstruct his vision. His sharp heavenly eye ability and dark perception allowed him to see his surroundings clearly even without opening his eyes, regardless of the environment. The reason why he lit the flame was only to illuminate the others. On the other side of the laboratory there was a door. Behind the door was the assembly workshop of the Titans. Glory of Thunder Hall. Further back there was the storm corridor. On both sides of the corridor, there was a corridor that led to the core of the laboratory. Each name was like a lamp in the darkness, lighting up in Brando's heart one by one. In the darkness, his thoughts were like a flood that broke through the dam, rushing forward uncontrollably. He realized that he had been here before. But the memory in his mind was blank. He did not remember when he came to this place and under what circumstances. In the game? Definitely not. In the game there was a player who obtained the mystery of the emerald, but that was from a lich who had entered the stagnant realm. Maybe there was someone, but it was definitely not him. He couldn't help but groan as he held his head in pain. Although he was trying to comfort Magadol, he was also feeling a deep sense of fear in his heart. Were the memories of his previous life real and complete? If even his memories were fake, then what else in this world was real? Was the environment he was in, the people around him, everything he had experienced real? How could he be so sure? Brando couldn't help but clench his fists in secret, but he couldn't stop his mind from continuing to run wildly. This laboratory that he had never set foot in actually became strangely familiar in his eyes at this moment. He closed his eyes. His mind had already passed through the storm corridor. It was a passage full of metal pipes, and further ahead was a thick alloy door. The door was tightly shut. He had never seen such a door before, but at this moment he realized that he recognized this door. Behind the door was the core area of the laboratory. He had never entered this area before, but he remembered that he was brought to this place by someone. That person even pointed behind the door and told him that one day he would return here. It was as if at this moment he really did return here. Brando felt his blood tremble a little, because he actually remembered clearly that the person who brought him here was a woman. She was called Gaia. This is the origin and end of everything, the answer to all questions. Sophie, one day you will return here, but when that time comes, you will be the one to decide everything. You will be the one to decide everything, the gentle voice repeatedly echoed in Brando's mind. Alaz had already found a magic lamp. The lamp was placed on a metal platform. The little female dragon fiddled with it and found that the lamp could still be used. And at this moment she felt that the surroundings had darkened. She knew that it was Brando dispelling the magic on his hand. Tisk! Alaz couldn't help but snort softly. She didn't expect Brando to be paying attention to her movements. While thinking of this, her hands did not slow down. She whispered a simple spell and was about to reactivate the magic circle on the magic lamp. In this brief moment of darkness, Yi Zichen's eyes lit up. Brando closed his eyes. He seemed to see countless scenes overlapping in front of him. His eyes seemed to become bright. It was a golden sea of clouds and heavy rays of sunlight. He lowered his head. Under his feet was a dark obsidian floor covered with a crystal lattice network used to transmit magic. He shook his head and looked up. He found a familiar scene in front of him. On the upper floor of a tower, outside the round hall were 12 black stone pillars. Outside the stone pillars, a golden sea of clouds floated up and down. Towering buildings stood among the sea of clouds, and in the distance, the Perkin sun emitted an eternal afterglow on the horizon. There were many tall and handsome humans standing in the room. They had black hair and golden eyes and wore robes. The robes were red on the left and black on the right, with a dark golden collar at the collar. The robes were entwined with an Ouroboros. There were a total of 11 people. One of them stepped forward and reached out to touch his eyelids. The ring of coiled serpent on his index finger shone with a silver light. Brando subconsciously took a step back, but found that he couldn't control his body at all. Then he heard those people begin to whisper. But this time, the soundless mouth seemed to have become clearer, because Brendel was surprised to find out that he could hear the sound. It was an extremely ancient language, but he naturally understood the meaning. His physique is too weak. Is this really the first generation? There is no doubt that he is from that era. Another resolute voice interrupted everyone. In order to get this sample, Martha did not hesitate to disturb the law of causality. Alright, we don't have much time left. Let's vote. How do we confirm that he is trustworthy, this human called Sophie? Because he is one with us. But, in the next generation, will everything really go according to our wishes? You must know that once we make this decision, we will lose all plans to remedy it. If we don't cut off all means of retreat, how can we win? We have missed 6 eras. History has already proven everything. This time we must believe in Martha's judgment. Then why can't we let him replace that girl? We still have a chance. But this time we are not the ones who make the decision. According to the rules of the meeting, arbiters please withdraw from the voting. The silver-robed men nodded and left their seats. They turned around and walked out of the round hall. The light suddenly became bright as if it had swallowed everyone in the hall. Brando suddenly jolted back to reality. He realized that it was Alaz who had lit up the magic lamp, and the bright light once again lit up the entire laboratory. At this time, Huanghua finally noticed the heavy expression on her teacher's face. She could not help but ask softly, "Teacher?" "I'm fine, Huanghua." Brando raised his head and looked at Princess Magadol apologetically. The latter's face was still a little pale. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "Mr. Brando, Magadol shook her head gently. "I still can't remember much about the past. I can't remember who attacked me." "It's okay. Brando sighed. Then don't think too much about it. He looked forward and his gaze fell on the other side of the exit. Let's move on. Akentu and the rest should have passed through here and are heading towards the core area of the laboratory. Brando's gaze fell on the center of the hall, where there were obvious traces of a battle. Alaz looked at the stained golden blood on the ground anxiously. The dragon race's sense of smell was very sensitive, and she could even distinguish the scent of Faropa from the blood. Faropa was injured, and this discovery made her very nervous. She could not help but think of the corpses she saw on the way, and was afraid that she would see Faropa's corpse next. However, she also knew that this wasn't the time for her to be willful. Putting everything else aside, the power of their opponent, the Lord of the Purgatory, Akentu, wasn't something that any of them could match. If they weren't careful, not to mention her and Fu Luo, even everyone present might be buried here forever. Brando finally saw the little female dragon's anxiety. Without saying a word, he led everyone through the laboratory and continued to move towards the core area. However, they had only taken 2 steps when they stopped. Because in the corridor behind the laboratory, they found a person covered in blood sitting against the wall. The other party's appearance was that of a human male, about 40 years old. He hung his head lifelessly like a corpse. But Brando knew that the other party was a giant dragon. He only needed to look at the golden blood flowing out of the wounds all over his body to understand. Garak. Alaz recognized her familiar companion for the first time. She subconsciously took a step forward, but suddenly thought of something and gritted her teeth and stopped. However, as if it had heard the little female dragon's low cry, the blood-covered dragon actually swayed slightly and raised its head with some difficulty. His movement caused chaos. Lotus almost screamed and hid behind Miss Magadal, and Phoenix Fire also put on a defensive posture. Mr. Liu and Fang Qi both unsheathed their swords. Chapter 1420. After all, everyone here understood that among the dragons in the stagnant realm, only Alaz was on their side at this moment. The rest were all the minions of the Twilight Dragon. But to everyone's surprise, the dragon coughed twice in a low voice before looking up at them. In the eyes that were half squinted because of the serious injury, the strange dark silver light disappeared and was replaced by a golden light. It was like a scorching flame. Garak. Alaz was almost in disbelief. You, Alaz? The dragon forced a smile with some difficulty. You really came. Mr. Garak? Brando also saw that the other party seemed to have recovered his consciousness. Garak smiled weakly. My time of death is near, Alaz and this human gentleman. But fortunately, at the last moment of my life, my soul was finally able to escape the shroud of darkness, allowing me to return to the eternal home of the dragons. Garak. Alaz finally confirmed that her companion had recovered, but she did not expect it to be under such circumstances. Her voice could not help but choke a little. Garak did not seem to care too much. His shining eyes swept across the little female dragon and finally fell on Brando. I know you, sir. Brando was slightly stunned. Mithril is my mate. Brando suddenly remembered the respectable silver dragon lady. He could not help but look at Garak with some pity. Of course he could see that the other party was determined to die. Through such means he was able to escape the claws of the Twilight Dragon. He may be able to save the other party's life with the Angel's Heart bottle, but he could see that the other party was not willing to let his soul be covered in dust again. Not to mention that the other party only had a moment left. Don't sigh for me, Mr. Brando, Garak replied with a smile, because I know that Mithril will remember me forever. To be able to live in the hearts of one's companions and spouse is also a kind of eternal life for the dragons. The little female dragon suddenly covered her mouth. She thought of herself and Fu Luofa. If there was a day when they had to face such a separation, then she would rather die than suffer such a fate. Garak silently glanced at Alaz and sighed in his heart. In his opinion, Alaz was too young to even understand the true meaning of life. I hope she can accept the matter of Fu Luofa, he thought in his heart. Is there anything you need us to pass on, Mr. Garak? Brando asked. No, I believe that Mithril can accept all of this calmly. Garak shook his head, but his eyes fell on Brando and slowly said, But I have something to tell you, Mr. Brando. Is it about the Twilight Dragon? Garak nodded slowly and painfully. It's about the Throne of Destiny. The Throne of Destiny? Garak took a deep breath and said, Mr. Brando, behind Lady Martha's Tiamat code, there is an unprecedented highest authority. In the past, this authority has only been used a few times, but every time, it has allowed our world to escape disaster. Our world has been able to survive the war with the Twilight Dragon time and time again because of this rule. Whenever the divine people cannot win in the war, we will restart the wound. This way we can at least preserve our last hope and hope to be able to win in the next war. In the 5th and 6th wars, in order to steal this authority itself and obtain complete victory in this protracted war, the Twilight Dragon finally made up its mind to project its body into our world. This is the origin of the Azure War. Brando frowned. In fact, he had known all of this for a long time. Whether it was the Bugas or Miss Tada, they had all told him all of this. He also believed that what the Twilight Dragon coveted was this authority itself, but the problem was that he still did not understand what this authority was. He faintly felt that perhaps this authority was in the stagnation realm, which was why the Twilight Dragon and its minions, Akentu, were so anxious. But at this moment he did not interrupt Garek but waited silently for him to continue. He had a hunch that perhaps the answer to the mystery was already in front of him. Garek exhaled with some difficulty. His mental state was obviously not very good, but he insisted on saying, "In the 6th war, the Twilight Dragon finally got the best opportunity dash." The next part of the story was a part of history that Brendel was both familiar and unfamiliar with. That was the final stage of the Azure War, where the divine people relied on Babel Fortress to hold on. But the divine people had realized that under such circumstances, the fall of the world was only a matter of time. The Truth Society was not afraid of failure, so it was just another repetition of history in the war between Wond and the Twilight Dragon. Although the divine people felt depressed because of this, and the repeated failures made them feel helpless, no matter what, the world had to be preserved. Therefore, the council once again proposed a plan to restart the world. This was just like the reflection of history, the scene that had played out over and over again in these 5 wars. But because of this, the divine people had a dispute. Gaia believed that repeated repetition would only consume Martha's power in vain, and one day, Wond would face the desperate situation after the gods left. The World Tree Organization was keen to recreate the glory of the divine people. Perhaps many things had already embarked on the wrong path from the beginning of this era, and restarting the glory before the 5th era would be beneficial for them to correct these mistakes and achieve the final victory in the war with the Twilight Dragon. The dispute in the council led to divergence, and the disunity of the will led to the tree herders going alone, resulting in the birth of the Bronze race. However, something unexpected happened. Because of the influence of dark magic, the Bronze tribe rebelled. These new generations created by the divine people eventually became the claws of the Twilight Dragon. This incident led to a further split in the Truth Society. And in this rebellion, the Twilight Dragon learned of the name that moved it, the Throne of Destiny. Was this the ultimate plan of the divine people to restart the world with the highest authority? Finally, by intercepting the bloodline of the Bronze race, the Twilight Dragon obtained a precious opportunity to analyze Martha's Tiamat law network. And in this analysis, it obtained an important piece of information. In this final plan called the Curved Surface Plan, or Wond Plan, the Throne of Destiny was in the most important position, and it knew that only the first generation of ancestors had the ability to activate this highest authority. The Twilight Dragon had been in contact with the first generation of planeswalkers who had fought with it a long time ago, and it knew the origin of these people. And it knew that the divine people of this era did not have this ability. Sure enough, not long after, the spies it buried in the tree herders sent back a piece of news that made it ecstatic. The divine people even did not hesitate to consume Martha's power to create a real pure-blooded female ancestor, what they called the first generation. At this moment, the Twilight Dragon understood that the opportunity to end everything had come. When Garek finished his last word, there was a strange silence around, and the air seemed to be filled with a breath called silence. No one came back to their senses. Although the voice of the seriously injured Garek was very low, it was particularly clear in this pin-drop environment. After a long time, Brando slowly said, "So, what happened after that? This happened at the end of the 6th era, but why was the Twilight Dragon defeated by the Azure Knight not long after that, leading to the end of the 6th era and the arrival of the Mortal Era?" Because, Jarek's lips curled into a chilling smile. All of this was the conspiracy of the Twilight Dragon. What did you say? Garek waved his hand with some difficulty. The Twilight Dragon understood that the best opportunity was already in front of it, but if the divine people were forced to restart this world, it would lose this opportunity. So, it deliberately showed its weakness to the enemy and descended into our world to give the Azure Knight a chance to injure it. In this way, the divine people would think that they had a chance to completely defeat the Twilight Dragon. However, in the final war, although the Twilight Dragon was defeated by the Azure Knight, it allowed the Crystal Army and the No race to attack Babel Fortress from behind. The Truth Society was caught off guard and the Tower of Babel was completely destroyed. Moreover, the most important thing is, the Twilight Dragon has already calculated everything. Its deep sleep is just an illusion because it has already left its will in the baby girl. When the mortals thought that they had won, sure enough, after the Sixth War the Azure Knight became a hero, and the era of the mortals came, and our world, Garrick coughed heavily twice, was also preserved. In the dead silence, only the calm voice of the Prime Minister's daughter sounded. So, the throne of destiny was not hidden again with the restart of the world. Without waiting for Garrick to answer, she continued, in the next 1,000 years the Myrnas established their country. In the era of the mortals, the power of the earth declined, the gods died, and the dragons were hidden. Then the War of the Holy Saints. After that, even the Silver Folk withdrew from the history of Wond. In the next 700 years, the Holy Saints established their country. Cruz, Fanzin, Saint Tassol, and Atlanta were established one after another. And 300 years later, that was our era? The voice of the Prime Minister's daughter trailed off. But there was a roaring sound in everyone's hearts, because in this era, it had finally come again. Chapter 14:21. The enemy we are facing may be the most ferocious and terrifying opponent of this era. Its existence is far from conquering, nor is it to rule and seize benefits. The destruction brought by the twilight is pure. It will return the world of Wond to chaos, just as its believers in the mortal world claim, the final judgment and the end of the world. Silver Scholar, Judd J. Robenrioland. This was the era of the twilight. In the face of the heavy reality, everyone was hesitant to move forward. This was the common opponent that humans had faced for 6 eras. However, even the gods had failed time and time again. How could the mortals, born of the black iron, raise their hands and feet in front of it? Everyone looked solemn. Even Brando's face was tense. He silently pursed his lips into a straight line. The Twilight Dragon has mastered the blood of the ancestors. Its goal is the ultimate secret of our world. Can we still make it in time? Garrick's lips were dry and cracked, but his face looked a little indifferent. That's just right. On the contrary, Fang Qi seemed a little strangely excited. The genius of the Phantom Chariot lineage seemed to have returned to his old ways at this moment. He paced back and forth feverishly. I've long been tired of the repeated days. To be honest, I've long been tired of the trivial calculations between my family and Phoenix Fire. Fang Qi waved his hand. And this is what I want, about the mystery of the emerald and everything behind it. Miss Delphian, do you remember what I told you? There was a flicker of fire in his dark eyes. He looked at everyone and then at Brando. If we can't participate in it ourselves, it will be the biggest regret of our lives. Brando, I believe in you. How about taking us to create a miracle? Brando ignored the guy who had returned to his old ways and only asked Garrick, I want to hear your opinion. Garrick also looked at Brando. Move forward or die, but this is our only chance. We have some reasons why we have to do it. Above the blue sea of Anglia, we saw the sunrise and everything that bathed in the sunlight. The sunrise we see today may be our last glimpse. The curtain of the past has fallen, and the long night of Wond is coming. But the endless darkness is not the long night. The long night is the wait before the dawn, Brando replied. Maybe, but that depends on you and me. Garrick coughed violently. It clenched its hand into a fist and pressed it against its chest. Mr. Garrick, is the secret here? Yes, it is the target of Akentu, Flora, and us. Then what is the seat of destiny? Garrick shook his head weakly. No one knows what it is, Mr. Brando. I don't know, Akenta doesn't know, and the Twilight Dragon doesn't know. It may just be a law, a kind of authority, or it may just be a name. Maybe only Lady Martha knows what it is. Master, no, the Twilight Dragon spent countless years to come here. The secret was placed under the ruins of the past order, in the flow of old time. Brando was silent for a moment. How strong is Akenta now? Garrick looked at him with his yellow eyes. There was no anxiety in his eyes, only steel-like coldness. Brando raised his head and he already understood. He looked at the dark corridor in front of him again. It lay there, immersed in the silent darkness as if thousands of years or even tens of thousands of years were just a moment. It would lead to an unknown and unpredictable future, and the time after that might be long or short, but it would be an eternal secret that no one knew. At this moment, Brando suddenly recalled such a scene. It was the sacred white field. The Flame King said so in his oath to the humans, elves, dwarves, silverfolk, and dragons. His voice echoed in the wilderness, like an ancient ghost that still lingered in the hearts of future generations. We will take this step, and after this step, it is the path to seek the truth. It may lead to victory or death. We have no way of knowing, but we can make a choice. Forward or backward. Brando subconsciously looked at the holy sword Odorfice in his hand. The dark blade shone faintly under the dim light, and every golden-red texture on the blade seemed to be flowing. With a common voice they told him the answer. Everyone's eyes were focused on Brando at this moment. They saw the young Earl from Erewhon lower his head and then raise it again. He looked at the dragon who was leaning against the wall and asked, "Are you all right?" Garak shook his head. "Mr. Brando," he asked weakly, "I only have one last question. Can you tell me what do you think the chances are?" "I don't know," Brando replied, "but I think there's still a chance." "There's still a chance," Garak smiled weakly, "then leave me here. If I can still have a beautiful dream in the dark, maybe I can still see Mithril." "Garak." The little female dragon clenched her claws. "No, Allahs, go forward, don't waste time." The little female dragon wanted to say something more, but Brando pressed the back of her hand and dragged her forward, past Garak. In the darkness, he felt Allahs instinctively struggle, but she quickly turned her palm around and clasped his hand tightly. The others also silently passed by Garak. Brando looked back and saw Phoenix Flame place her sword in front of her chest and salute the other party. It was like a poem blooming in the darkness, quiet as a trickle. Akenta looked at the giant door shining with a metallic light. The door was engraved with the scene of Martha's creation. A little light rose from her hand, and each light beam was drawn by countless stretched lines, passing through the clouds and the sea of fire, covering the whole world, boundless. "Deliberately mystifying," Akenta said with a look of contempt. "Where is this place?" "This is Marcia's kingdom," Gaia calmly replied. Before Marcia fell into her eternal slumber, she had placed the highest authority of Tiamat in this place. Entering this place requires an extremely high level of authority, and after the era of Azure, no divine citizen has been allowed to enter this place. Akenta heard this name and hesitated for a moment. But fanaticism made him put down his concerns. He waved his claws and roared, "Open it!" Martha had long left this world, and the gods fell into an eternal sleep because Tiamat's network ran out of magic. At this moment, this place was just an abandoned wasteland. The ball of light flickered. Akenta immediately felt a tremor in the entire space. He looked around vigilantly, suspecting that the goddess of earth was up to something again, but nothing unusual seemed to happen. Suddenly, a trickle of light flowed out from Martha's fingertips on the giant door in front of him, and the bright light spread in all directions along the lines of the relief. As if in an instant, the entire door shone brightly and became abnormally dazzling. "What is this?" he asked in a sharp voice. But just as he finished speaking, the dazzling light had dissipated, and Akenta found that the giant door in front of him had disappeared, and a vast and mysterious space appeared behind it. An ancient galaxy lay in front of him, and in the midst of billions of bright lights, among countless burning stars, there was a gem quietly placed. It was an organic gem, or to be exact, an amber. It was very large, about a few stories tall, and its surface reflected the starlight and emitted a soft bright yellow light. In the center of its irregular geometric shape, there was a dazzling shadow. Akenta recognized at a glance that it was the shape of the continent of Wond. It was placed in the center of this world, and circles of silver protective equipment wrapped around it. The flowing light in the amber was like a dazzling halo. However, the light of the stars passed through this halo, making it seem as if it was immersed in a river of time. At that moment, even the king of demons could not help but be stunned. "It's actually here." Akenta's scorched yellow vertical pupils showed a hint of surprise. "The fire seed that you have carefully preserved from the past world, the only treasure of this world, the throne of destiny." He subconsciously took a step toward the amber, but a figure had already swept past him. It was Flora. The latter instantly turned into a sharp arrow and shot toward the amber. She tried her best to reach out, and her fingertips almost touched the bright surface of the amber, but the Purgatory Lord snorted coldly at this moment. At that moment, Fu Luofa let out a miserable cry and fell from the sky as if she had been struck by lightning. As soon as the girl landed, she hugged herself in pain. The capillaries under the skin of her arms seemed to come alive and rolled between her muscles. Large beads of sweat rolled down her forehead, and her face was as pale as paper. "You don't know what's good for you." Akenta looked at her coldly and sneered. "Akenta?" Flora's two slender and beautiful eyebrows were almost entangled with each other. She clenched her teeth and stared at the Purgatory Lord with blazing eyes. "You know the consequences of betraying the Master." Akenta choked. He looked back at the amber, with some fascination. The lofty throne was so charming and so enchanting. That was the supreme authority of Martha's Tiamat code, and also the only shortcut to the power of existence. No wonder Ekis was so fascinated by it that he did not hesitate to betray his master. Chapter 1422. For a moment, the Lord of Purgatory's heart was shaken. Fu Luofa's stare made him upset. Of course, he knew the consequences of betraying Dusk. But in a moment, his greedy desire drowned his reason. "Master only wants to destroy this world," it spoke with a heavy voice. "As long as Tiamat's highest authority remains in our hands, the divine folk will never have another chance to redo their lives. It won't care about these minor details." "Akentu," Fu Luofa shouted. "Are you crazy?" Her repeated challenges finally exhausted the patience of the Demon King. Akenta suddenly roared and swept the silver dragon girl away with a wave of his claws. She fell heavily back into the original hall, and there was no sound from then on. "Fu Luofa." The remaining dragon cried out in shock, but under the cold gaze of the Purgatory Master, it stopped in its tracks. "What, you want to go with her?" Akenta asked coldly. "No, I don't dare, my lord." The dragon finally understood the situation. It looked regretfully at Fu Luofa's direction and did not dare to have any objections. "Very good." Akenta nodded in satisfaction. Then he turned around and looked at the amber, with greed. He murmured, "This time it belongs to me." For this, I did not hesitate to wait for nearly 10,000 years. The Demon King could not help but raise its head and roar. "The so-called gods and your ancient creators, the divine people, the Bugas, the dragons, Robdis and Wilcadia, you two fools who are all brawn and no brains. Do you see that? In the end I intend to have the last laugh." As he spoke he could not help but laugh. This devilish laughter echoed in the entire space as if the entire world was trembling. However, to everyone's surprise, a slightly calm voice answered it. "I'm afraid you won't have the last laugh, Akentu." This voice caused the Demon King to turn around instantly and stare at the direction of the voice. There, a group of people were slowly walking into the hall outside. The person in the lead was the young man who made him suffer again and again on the Black Moon waterway. "Humans?" Akenta squeezed out these two words from between his teeth. Brendel raised his head without showing any signs of weakness and looked into the eyes of the Demon King. Akenta roared, and the pressure of a demigod was almost overwhelming, causing everyone behind him to stagger. Even Alas could not help but take a step back. However, Brando held the holy sword Odorfice in his hand and remained unmoved. It was as if Akenta's law and territory seemed to be involuntarily separated as soon as they touched him. As if there was something on Brando that made them afraid of him, and they did not dare to approach him. Akentu, he could not help but widen his eyes. How was this possible? He was just a mere human. But he immediately thought that it was the holy sword Odorfice in Brando's hand that played a role. He could not help but say hatefully, "This is really beyond my expectations. You dare to come to me and die. Do you think you can challenge me with a mere golden flame blade?" Kento. At this time, Brando also saw the huge amber behind the Demon King. Beside him, the little female dragon Alaz suddenly exclaimed. She had already seen Fu Luofa lying on the ground, not knowing whether she was dead or alive. She quickly rushed over. At this time, Brando's voice was almost contemptuous. "Akentu, when your clone was easily killed by me, your tone was not like this. Are you trying to provoke me, human?" "You know I don't need it." Brando shook his head. "If I can squash your clone like a bug, I can squash you like a bug, Akentu." Akenta let out a terrifying roar, and his eyes were bloodshot almost instantly. He had always been ashamed that his clone was accidentally killed. It was just that before the seal was lifted, he had neither the spare strength nor the strength to wash away this shame. Now that he had finally broken the seal, he had to temporarily suppress his anger because he had to fight for this seat of destiny. This anger buried in the bottom of his heart did not fade. Instead, it became more and more furious. If it were not for the goal of nearly 10,000 years, he would not have tolerated it. However, at this time, he would never have thought that these reckless bugs would not only dare to take the initiative to appear in front of him, they even dared to provoke him. As the saying goes, don't hit people in the face and don't expose people's shortcomings when scolding them. Not only did Brando expose their shortcomings, but his words were also like a cold and sharp spear that pierced deep into Akenta's wound. How could he tolerate it? However, the final goal was close at hand. At this moment, Akenta finally maintained his last bit of calmness. He turned back and roared at the dragon who had just surrendered to him. "What are you waiting for? Go and kill these damn bugs." That dragon was dumbfounded. He looked at Brando. Of course, he knew how terrifying this young man's strength was. Previously, when they joined forces with Fu Luofa, they were still firmly suppressed by the latter. Now he was the only dragon here. Needless to say, Fu Luofa, who was the strongest among them, was not even alive. How could he be a match for this terrifying demon? However, he had to move because he knew how terrifying the Purgatory Lord behind him was. If a demigod wanted to kill him, it would not be much more difficult than crushing a bug. At the thought of Akenta's coldness and brutality, this unlucky dragon finally made a decision. He could only bite the bullet and charge toward Brando. As soon as he took his first step, Brando raised his right hand with a cold expression. At that moment, this dragon felt as if the connection between his body and his mind was separated. He was fixed in midair just like that. He was too familiar with such an encounter. He knew very well that this seemingly harmless young man in front of him was actually an expert in manipulating space and time. A controller of space and time elements, a true sage. At that moment, the last sound he heard was the sound of his bones breaking all over his body. Everyone present witnessed this scene with their own eyes. Brando just raised his hand and pinched a dragon to death. They saw that the dragon's whole body was oozing blood, and his head drooped down weakly. Then Brando casually threw him to Akentu as if he was throwing trash. "This is your new subordinate, Akentu?" Brando sneered coldly. "He compliments your good-for-nothing master well. As the saying goes, like master, like servant." "Very well." Akentu was so angry that he trembled all over. Although he was a cunning and suspicious existence among demons, his irritable nature still prevailed at this moment. His rage finally overwhelmed his reason and he roared, "Let me see what tricks you have up your sleeves. I hope you won't kneel down and beg me later." With a wave of his hand, he swept the limp dragon's body away. At the same time, his whole body had turned into a red hurricane and swept toward Brando and the others. When Akenta really attacked, everyone present realized that they had underestimated the power of a demigod. Although the power of the Demon King came from chaos and dusk, which was not the same as the division of power in Martha's Law, there was no essential difference between absolute power at a certain height. If the sage was the boundary between mortals and gods, then what Akenta had just witnessed was truly the power of a demigod. Then, the power that Akenta displayed at this moment was already true divine power. It was the kind of power that could intertwine with the laws and surpass the power of a world. All things were destroyed and born because of it. The whole starry sky resonated with it. Everyone seemed to see the scene of space and time shattering, reconstructing, and then resurrecting from the ashes. Only Brando could understand such power. That was the power of the most perfect silver body. Akenta's full-powered blow directly set off a terrible storm. It was like the moment of a supernova explosion. Hundreds of billions of pulses and energy swept across. Before it reached them, everyone present had already reached a common thought in their hearts. That's right. It was unstoppable. Huang Ho bit her lower lip tightly. Her eyes reflected this ray of light. She clenched her fists but she could not move at all. Beside her, Fang Qi and Mr. Liu had already lost their minds. Ling and Lian even had a look of confusion and despair in their eyes. "Human, the law that you are so proud of is not worth mentioning at all." Akenta sneered. "You don't understand what is true power, and what is true existence." Princess Magadal's face was pale. "Everyone?" She seemed to have an endless abyss of darkness in her heart. She used the last of her strength to squeeze out a few words. "Be careful." But another voice quickly drowned out her voice. That voice was calmer and more determined and calm. Brando faced this almost unstoppable blow. Not only was there no fear in his eyes, but there was a flash of light. He whispered, "Alas, now is the time." A domain was completely opened. It was like a staggered space. A circle of water rippled between the stars. It swept past everyone. Then Brando disappeared. It moved forward and the floor of the hall disappeared. The water continued to move forward and collided with the storm brought by Akentu. Then the terrible storm also disappeared. Finally, under Akenta's astonished gaze, it passed by him. At that moment, the Lord of Purgatory also disappeared. The space trembled slightly. Chapter 1423. Everything seemed to have returned to its original state. Everything quieted down, and everyone seemed to have regained control of their bodies in an instant. Huang Hua, Ling, Lotus, Mr. Liu, and Fang Qi fell to the ground in an instant. "Brando!" Allah screamed. But she immediately reacted. She knew in her heart that she did not have much time left. Could even be said that it was only a split second. The little female dragon immediately turned around, and the huge amber was reflected in her golden pupils. This time there was no one in front of her. "Brando," Allah clenched her sharp fangs, "you must hold on." And in the next moment she was already like a golden arrow, shooting towards the center of the vast galaxy. The constantly spinning amber was only inches away from her. Her hand had even passed through the layers of metal protective equipment. Finally, she was about to reach the amber. But time froze at this moment. Allah heard a scream coming from behind her. She already knew that it was Miss Magadal's voice, but she did not have time to turn around. In the next moment she felt a cold hand grabbing her ankle. She swung her hand forward with all her might, but she only missed the amber by a hair's breadth. No. Allah only felt her vision go dark. She turned around subconsciously, and just happened to see a pair of deep, flickering eyes with a dark silver light. "That is not something that belongs to you, Allah." "No." "Falofa?" The little female dragon's voice was almost a moan of despair. The moment he opened the polar plane, Brando could be said to have prepared himself for the consequences. He was so familiar with all of this, so familiar with all of the possibilities that unfolded with all of this. Even if he closed his eyes, every classic battle tactic from his previous life seemed to reappear in front of his eyes. That was the power of the polar plane. Regardless of whether it was strong or weak, it could contain all opponents and all attacks into its kingdom. Using this unique power, the players had developed countless possibilities. The many bizarre tactics and classic battle examples had created miracles of the weak defeating the strong in the other world more than once. The players called it a bug, but the officials never cared about it. That used to be one of the biggest puzzles in Amber. But at this moment, Brando thought that he might already know the reason. This was because in a world where resurrection was impossible, the extreme planes and all of its characteristics were so ordinary. A Lemiter would never risk his life to rashly lure an opponent who was much stronger than himself into his own kingdom. However, there were always exceptions to everything. Facing the Lord of Purgatory Akenta's attack, Brendel suddenly realized that he did not have the slightest bit of fear. It was even difficult to find such an emotion in his heart when he absorbed this Devil King into his own law and kingdom. He suddenly realized that what was surging in his heart was actually excitement. The classic miraculous battles of the past. At this moment she was reborn in his heart. So much so that when he saw Akenta's expression change abruptly and reveal a terrified expression, a smug smile even appeared at the corner of his mouth. That's right. The moment Brando opened the extreme planes, Akenta understood that he had been fooled. This human couldn't defeat him, but he didn't seem to need to defeat him either. Because in fact, the moment he made his move, the outcome of this battle had already been decided. "How dare you?" Akenta couldn't help but widen his eyes. He saw the sneer on Brando's face and his heart was already cold. This coldness instantly turned into a kind of shame that went straight to the top of his head, and all the shame and anger turned into a heart full of murderous intent at this moment. He let out a shrill scream, and when he made his move again, it was already a full blow with anger. But in fact, this didn't make much of a difference to Brando. Because in his extreme planes, it was impossible for him to resist such a blow. Even if he unfolded his kingdom, the power of this blow would be magnified thousands of times. Just like the unlucky bastard he killed in the Battle of Ampere Seal. Thinking of Williams, Brando couldn't help but reveal a bitter smile. He didn't expect that the same thing would happen to him one day, and he didn't know if this was a kind of retribution. Then he silently lowered his head and watched as Akenta's claws passed through his defense without any hindrance, and swept heavily on his chest. The aftermath of this blow directly swept through the entire extreme planes that was formed by the laws of time and space. As a result, the entire extreme planes almost completely collapsed in an instant. Brando only felt his vision turn black at that moment. He opened his mouth wide and almost couldn't make a sound. Although he had already predicted Akenta's power, he still didn't expect the power of this Purgatory Lord to be so terrifying at this moment when he was angry. Pages of light screens popped up in front of his eyes almost at the same time, and each page was full of warning messages. He saw his HP drop rapidly, and it could even be said that it was only a moment before the long HP bar turned black. Then the unyielding talent instantly took effect, and the HP value changed at an unimaginable speed until it became an almost uncountable number. And in front of this number, there was a shocking minus sign. But it was far from the only time. The extreme planes collapsed, and all abilities related to elements were instantly locked down. The pages that represented the elemental realm all turned gray, and skills and descriptions began to disappear one by one, and all elemental abilities collapsed one by one, and finally returned to the initial elementary concept of static and stable. And then the EXP that was affected, the EXP bar was shrinking at a speed visible to the naked eye, and the numbers above were madly shrinking, and Brando could even feel the weakness of power leaving him. He knew very well that this was the collapse of the power level caused by the collapse of the extreme realm. For all of this he was actually prepared in his heart, but when he really faced such a scene, Brando couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. But at least he won. As long as Alaz could take away the Amber, and the others. He knew that Akenta couldn't keep him, and the unyielding talent would at least save his life. Without the mystery of the Emerald Mystery, Akenta would never leave this stopped world. This place would become the new and eternal prison for the King of Demons. And this was also his plan. The extreme planes was dissipating at an alarming rate. Brando stared at Akenta, who crossed paths with him, and the latter obviously had not yet reacted. It could hardly believe that under its attack, in the law kingdom of a human who was only in the domain of the sage, its attack did not directly kill him. The Demon King could not help but groan in its heart at that moment, wondering what had happened to this world in the nearly 10,000 years it had been sealed. It watched as Brando's life rapidly faded in front of its eyes, but no matter how it faded, the other party always maintained signs of life. "You are not human?" It could not help but scream in shock and anger. "Immortal, how is this possible? How can there be such a person in this world? You are a divine citizen." "No, even a divine citizen has a moment of eternal stillness. Who are you?" Brando sneered. He did not dare to waste too much time, and subconsciously reached for the angel's heart vase in the floating celestial sphere. But at this moment, his hand froze. The stunned expression on Akenta's face also stopped at the last moment. Both of them saw the last moment of the extreme planes dissipating. But what they saw was not the scene they imagined. Standing in the middle of the vast galaxy was the figure of a young girl. She was wearing a long robe, but it could not hide her graceful figure. Her black hair was scattered behind her, dancing without wind. She turned her head, and her dark silver eyes swept across Brando and Akenta's faces with a trace of pity and ridicule. Alaz fell at her feet, floating in space with her head down. No one knew whether she was dead or alive. "You," Akenta's face changed dramatically and could not help but scream, "You damn reptile, how dare you!" However, it suddenly stopped talking. His face turned pale, and his huge body started to tremble uncontrollably. It was as if he wasn't a powerful demigod, but an insignificant character. "Akenta," the young girl spoke, but it was not the voice of Fu Luofa. "You disappoint me." Brando only needed a moment to distinguish the voice. "Roman? No." He was almost moaning as he muttered to himself. "Twilight Dragon." "Human?" Fu Luofa's gaze fell on Brando. "We meet again. I'm glad you brought my servant to this place. The result will not change. You should understand this is fate." Akenta collapsed in an instant. "Next," Fu Luofa continued, "is the moment to reveal the fate of this world, although it has been a long time since it came." After that, the young girl turned around and walked towards the floating amber. A moment later, Fu Luofa stopped and the amber was already in front of her. "Fu Luofa," the young girl spoke again, "my loyal servant, I will grant you this honor. Go get it and bring it to me." "Yes, as you wish." When Fu Luofa replied, she had already returned to her original voice, but it was frighteningly calm. "My respected master." She slowly reached out her hand towards the amber. That was the most dazzling gem on Martha's supreme scepter. It was the beginning of the end of a world. Her snow-white fingers slowly moved forward, touching the surface of the amber, and then gently retracted, as if her fingertips were about to touch the smooth surface of the amber. But at that moment, she grabbed nothing but air. Chapter 1424. At that moment, Flofa's hand seemed to have passed through the non-existent amber and grabbed nothing. Even if he lost his courage due to fear, Akenta, who was paralyzed on the ground, could not help but widen his eyes when he saw this scene. "What is this?" he screamed hoarsely. "Gaia, you lied to me?" However, no one cared about his fear and resentment, because the voice of the Demon King was quickly drowned out by an even sharper howl. It was the voice of Flofa, which was also the voice of the Twilight Dragon. In an instant the world trembled slightly. Where Flofa's fingertips touched, a white light suddenly burst out from the amber. It was like a flowing light vein, extremely dazzling. And the next moment, A dazzling light wheel bloomed, followed by a shockwave. Brando saw the dazzling light explode in his vision, like a blooming flower of light. It was like the birth and death of a new star, from a grain of light to a dazzling burst of light. At that moment, Flofa's figure was engulfed by the endless light, followed by Allah's little female dragon. Brando widened his eyes and subconsciously reached out his hand. But what he could grab was destined to be nothing more than nothingness. The bright light swept in all directions, strands, rays, they intertwined into a stream of light, gushing out. In an instant it affected the entire world. For some reason when he saw this scene, this sentence flashed in Brando's mind without warning. When Martha was born, light was born. Light lit up the eternal darkness, that was the beginning of everything. He shook his head as if he wanted to expel this strange thought from his mind. However, his mind was groggy and his eyelids were heavy. The system was repeatedly emitting ear-piercing screams and warnings in his mind. Warning, heart and lung function is declining. Warning, excessive blood loss, life in danger. Warning, vital signs are disappearing. However, this clamor was very familiar to him. It was as if he had experienced something similar in a certain scene. Warm light flowed around his body. In this white world, Brando seemed to hear another voice. That voice was gentle and quiet, like a woman's soft hand caressing his tired soul and the wounds all over his body, calming him down and telling him, "My dear child, please go to sleep. At this moment you only need to rest and everything in this world has nothing to do with you anymore. You don't belong here, do you?" "No, little female dragon, alas." Brando shook his head vigorously, trying to wake himself up. He knew that he could not close his eyes at this moment, otherwise, what awaited him would be eternal sleep. "I came here," he shouted at himself hoarsely in his heart, "is to change everything for Erwin, for the princess, for the Roman and Freya, for everything I love, so that there will be no more regrets. You must not give up, Brando, so you must wake up." Brando subconsciously grabbed the angel's heart vase in his hand, but at this moment, something that terrified him happened. He found that he had grabbed nothing. His heart sank endlessly. Brando subconsciously turned his head, just in time to see the milky white teardrop-shaped pendant turn into dust in his hand. When the pure and flawless light swept over it, everything was gone with the wind. Then he heard a scream. It was Akenta's voice. When the Demon King was engulfed by the flawless light, white smoke came out from all over his body. Then, starting from his skin and muscles, his entire body began to disintegrate, turning into little white lights and dissipating into nothingness. "Martha. No." This was the last syllable that Brando heard from the burning dusk, the great demon, the Demon King with a sheep's head, the Lord of Purgatory, Akentu. Then, the Demon King was born into nothingness before his eyes. Everything faded away. He saw a woman appear beside Akentu. A girl of 13 or 14 years old, with long green hair, quiet eyes and pointed ears. It was the image of Sifrid. Except for the quiet demeanor and temperament, they were exactly the same. The girl glanced at him, her mouth opened and closed as if she was answering him. But there was no sound. But Brando recognized the shape of her mouth. "I did not lie to you, Akentu," the gentle voice replied calmly, "because you can't understand the meaning of nobility. If you want to wear the crown, you must bear its weight." In the gray world. It was as if, for a moment, the huge abandoned city suddenly emitted a buzzing sound from the depths of its interior. It was like a huge illusion, but in an instant the illusion became reality. Because on the desolated horizon, the top of the huge black tower that pierced straight into the sky suddenly became bright. In the hole at the top of the black tower, a dazzling ball of light that was like the sun lit up. A figure appeared on the top of the tower. It was a pair of beautiful silver eyes. She silently looked at the earth, silently looked at the sky, silently looked at the whole lifeless world. But at that moment, a path of light extended out from the huge ball of light under the lady's feet. It flowed down the body of the black tower. The light poured into the ground under the tower and then spread out in all directions. The city that had been shrouded in darkness began to brighten up one by one. She looked at all of this. It was as if after thousands of years, this stagnant world had once again come alive. Then she looked up. Under the gentle gaze, the silver lines of law rose from the arc-shaped sky. They crossed thousands of miles, intertwined and weaved with each other, and gradually formed a huge network full of grids. And that was the network Brando saw in Wond, Tiamat's network. When every node of this huge network began to brighten, the gray clouds began to separate to the sides, revealing the network of light and the dark purple sky behind. And on the eastern horizon, there was a line of red clouds that was slowly rising. Martha felt a little sad. Because that was the last sunrise left after countless years of silence in this world. Its time had stopped here, but finally at this moment, it bloomed in front of her eyes with the last moment of this world. She saw the Witch King constellation, Lyra constellation, Winter Moon constellation, the Platinum Dragon Bahamut, the Blue Calamity, and the blazing and crystal stars. It was a sky full of stars. They reappeared in the sky one by one. It was the sky of a past world, but at this moment they were also the sky of Wond. At this moment they were equally dazzling. She silently looked at all of this. Above the clouds, a pair of black eyes opened. Those eyes were flickering with anger and resentment, as if a vortex-like void had formed around it. That pair of eyes stared at her. Then a dignified and deep voice echoed, "Martha, as expected, you were still hiding in this place." That voice rumbled above the clouds like thunder. The anger contained in it seemed to want to burn this world. The first rays of dawn on the horizon divided the world, the night sky, and the stars in Martha's eyes into two. But in the depths of her eyes, the red of the sky was reflected, seeming quiet and deep. Martha's tone was very calm. "This is only the last consciousness I left behind. The last energy of my network is placed in the throne, waiting for this moment after 1,000 years, dusk. You did everything you could to protect these lowly insects, but it was meaningless. You won this time, but what about next time? And the time after that? You will not be able to protect this world forever. Martha, the inheritor of the ancestors' bloodline, is already in my hands. One day, everything will end in my hands." Martha did not answer. The Twilight Dragon sneered. "Actually, you no longer exist in this world, Martha. I learned about your death from the network you created. Your comrades, your creators, all of them have fallen into eternal slumber in this war. In the end, even you were not spared. But I, on the other hand, am eternally. It's a pity, Martha. I can't let you see the moment when everything is realized. The end of all things, the end of the world. The result of this war between us can only be witnessed by me alone in the end." The Twilight Dragon's tone was somewhat bleak. "Well, there will be an end to all of this, Martha. 6 years of war. As my opponent, perhaps in my long memory I can remember this moment, remember you lowly insects. In a sense, for you, this is enough to be proud." Its voice gradually faded away. That pair of pitch-black eyes slowly closed after seeing the last sunrise of this world. Martha looked in the direction where the Twilight Dragon left with a calm expression. "Your arrival here has proven everything, Dusk. For thousands of years, all the sacrifices made by the gods have had value at this moment," Martha replied softly. At that moment, the rising sun on the horizon cast the first ray of dawn on her face. "Because the long night has passed and dawn is coming. You only got one thing wrong, Dusk. The sages and I have never regarded escape as the final salvation." Chapter 1425. The whole world suddenly quieted down. Even the system's warning that kept echoing in his mind completely disappeared at this moment. "Gaia, you are the goddess Gaia." Brando suddenly realized something and could not help but shout to the girl who looked like Sifrid, "Please help us." But he could not hear any sound even though his mouth opened and closed. Gaia turned her head, and her green eyes stopped on him. There was a peaceful gentleness in her eyes. The girl nodded at him, then turned around and disappeared into the white light. Brendel could feel his heart sinking to the bottom. He subconsciously turned around. His vision seemed to be filled with illusions. He saw Magadol shouting something to him, but the nun princess' mouth was opening and closing, and there was no sound at all. In that direction, the little girl Ren was holding her head, as if she was screaming silently. Her sister was protecting her under her body, and the two sisters were hugging each other tightly. Fang Qi and Mr. Lu were struggling to hold on, blocking the wind in front of the two sisters. Fang Qi seemed to be shouting something to him, but he could not hear it. Huang Huo was running towards him. She reached out her hand, but it was tightly held by the fairy lute. He saw the little fairy was gesturing something to him. After a while, he finally understood the meaning of the gesture. "Martha." Brando suddenly turned around. In the center of the whole world, white light was flowing along the surface of the amber. It intertwined to form a stream of light, wrapping the entire gem in it, forming a huge cocoon of light. However, in a world of whiteness, Brando suddenly saw a woman's figure slowly walking out of the light. She seemed to be a simple woman, but in an instant, she was so dignified and noble that one could only look up to her. She seemed to be a mother or a kind elder, but in an instant she gave off the aura of a young girl in youth. The charm of a woman seemed to be fluctuating from her body, unpredictable and unpredictable. Brendel could not see the other person's face clearly in the light, but he understood that the other person was smiling at him. It was a smile of praise, and there was a trace of familiarity and intimacy in it. She nodded slightly at him. It was a gentle and quiet voice, as if it could heal all the scars in one's heart. I said, I will give you wings of light. So one day I can make you king. My child. In the dark world, a bright and gentle light appeared in his vision. After a while, Brando realized that it was a passage of light. What is this place? Where am I? He thought in his heart, but his feet involuntarily moved forward. The light in front of him became brighter and brighter, as if the whole world was enveloped by this light. Everything around him was white. In this light he gradually heard a sound. It seemed to be a group of people shouting noisily. The crowd was shouting something. Just as he was trying to make out the noise, a group of knights suddenly passed by him. Brando turned around in shock and saw that those people were running forward in the light. Not far away there was a crying baby girl lying on the ground. When he saw the knights cautiously approaching the baby girl, he cried out in surprise and joy, "Found her! Kill her, demon girl! Thank you, Martha, we are saved." Brando suddenly froze. Roman? Roman? His gaze fell on the baby girl and he felt as if something was stuck in his throat. Then he saw the knights shouting and pulling out their swords. Brando subconsciously wanted to pull out Holy Sword Odorfice, but he grabbed empty air. He panicked and lowered his head. He did not know when, but he was wearing a black and red robe. The place where his sword was originally hanging was also empty. No! He saw the knight raise their swords and shouted subconsciously. However, before the knights could make a move, they suddenly disappeared in the light. Their bodies seemed to have turned into countless specks of dust and disappeared with the wind. Brando looked at this scene in shock. Just as he was about to move forward, another group of people brushed past him. They were people wearing black and red robes that were almost identical to his own. They passed by him but did not look at him. Instead, they walked to Romaine and picked her up from the ground. One of them looked at the Roman with an indescribable expression. He shook his head heavily. What a nightmare. He reached out to kill the Roman. Brendel was so frightened that he rushed forward and grabbed the man's hand. But before he could say anything, another person beside him said, "Don't worry about it. She is at least our most successful creation. You can't just destroy her like this. This is the result of our joint efforts. Maybe there are other ways. Everything will have to wait for the council's joint decision." The man holding the Roman hesitated. His hand stopped in midair. If this plan fails completely, we may have to compromise. No. Maybe there is a second way. The plan of the Druids may not succeed. The Bronze tribe is violent and full of flaws. The council will not approve of it. This is not good news, my brother. The Watchers have found that Martha is acting strangely. In the past few days, she has used 70 to 80% of the network's energy several times. Although it was very short, there are still traces. What is our great mother doing? Projection. She seems to be projecting something. The man was silent. He put down his hand. I have to talk to her. Brendel looked at all of this in shock, but in an instant, the figures of these people in long robes also disappeared into thin air. The last one to disappear was the baby girl. Brando felt that the merchant girl looked at him strangely. There was surprise and nostalgia in her eyes. He was about to say something, but she also disappeared. At this moment, Brando suddenly realized that all of this was manipulated. He turned his head and shouted in this snow-white world, "My lord, I've been waiting for a long time. Lady Martha, I know you are here, but I don't understand. What is all of this for?" But there was no voice in the space that answered his question. Then he saw another scene. There stood a young girl. She was only 13 or 14 years old. Her face was a copy of Sifrid's, but she was older. She had a head of dreamy green hair that fell to the ground like a waterfall. She stood barefoot on the snow-white ground. It was the goddess Gaia. Brando recognized her at a glance. But at this time, the goddess did not seem to see him. She was facing a direction and seemed to be talking to someone. Mother, the power of the network is almost exhausted. I have arranged for everyone to enter standby mode, but the divine people seem to have noticed something. Let me see Azure, I will explain everything to them. A gentle voice replied. Brando recognized the owner of the voice in an instant. It was Martha, mother of all things. But, Gaia replied, is all of this really necessary, mother? Why do we have to deny the divine people's plan? Haven't we always done this for 5 generations? Because, Gaia, we can protect this world for a while, but we cannot protect it forever. One day we will disappear. So before that, we must make a decision. Is this the origin of the curved surface plan, Mother? But why can't all of the divine people know about this? Is it because of the Bronze Tribe's betrayal? The Twilight Dragon has infiltrated my network. I can feel its presence, but this is also our best chance, Gaia. Gaia nodded silently. I understand, Mother. But she paused and asked, the next era, will it really be as we think? Will we really be able to obtain the final victory? I do not know, my child. But everything has the possibility of its existence. This may be the uncertain fate of our world, but there will always be one person who will control it. All the voices seemed to gradually become softer and softer until they could no longer be heard. The image of the goddess Gaia also disappeared in an instant. The surroundings seemed to have become quiet again. But at this time, a gentle voice suddenly sounded in Brando's mind. You have many doubts in your heart, don't you, my child? Brando suddenly turned around and looked around as if he wanted to see someone. But he found nothing. He suppressed the shock in his heart and asked, Lady Martha, is that you? It is me, child. Brando was silent for a moment before asking, My lady, where is this place? Where am I? Am I still alive? This is my world, Martha replied in a gentle voice. As for whether you are still alive or not, I think you have the answer in your heart, don't you, my child? Brando was silent. After a while, he finally asked the question that had been in his heart. Lady Martha, you know where I came from, don't you? I know where everyone comes from, the gentle voice replied. My child, I know what you are thinking in your heart. Perhaps I will give you the answer. Brando suddenly saw a sandstorm in front of him. The dust and sand gathered into a tower, forming a scene that he felt familiar with. He stood in the middle of a street. There were tall buildings on both sides of the road, and the traffic was shuttling back and forth. Looking back, he could even see the dazzling array of shopping malls and billboards. On one of the billboards, there was even a poster about the Amber Sword. All of this was so familiar to him. It was everything in another world. His past memories. Chapter 1426. He even saw a person. It was a middle-aged man, wearing a pair of black-rimmed glasses and holding a briefcase. He was walking towards him. For a moment, Brando almost raised his hand to greet the man. Everything was just like the old days. That was his teacher, who occupied a very important part of his childhood memories. He even remembered that the teacher had a daughter, a lively little girl. But how many years ago was that? 10 years? 20 years? Brando was a little stunned as he watched the man walk past him. Then, everything vanished into thin air. Lady Martha, this is... Brando felt that his voice was slightly hoarse. My child, Martha's gentle voice echoed, everyone has their own past. We are the same. The divine people once came from such a world. That world was destroyed in the flames of war, and the people who survived were called the first generation. They were the ancestors or the Matatanians travelers. They brought everything of the past with them and traveled among the many worlds until they came to this world. That was the story before the first era. With the joint efforts of the ancestors, we built everything. I created this world and called it the Wand. However, the civilization and order that we brought from the past world was so incompatible with this new world. When the old and new order clashed, the hostility of this world, the Twilight, woke up from the chaos. Thus began the curtains of the war that had lasted for so long. Although it was not the first time Brando heard about this history, Martha's personal description made him yearn for the epic history. The inheritance of the civilization between the two worlds, the ancestors of the Planeswalker, used their almost great power to create such a miracle. Then, everything that mortals saw in this era was born. However, Martha's tone wasn't arrogant, and she didn't seem to be proud of it. My child, since the beginning of the ancient war, we were destined to fight against the will of this world. Therefore, in every war we have almost lost. In order to preserve ourselves, I left the Sword of Fate, Amber, in the supreme authority of Tiamat as the last resort to restart this world. And in the 5 wars after that, almost every time we survived through it. Amber? Brando was a little puzzled. Isn't that the throne of destiny? He raised his head and suddenly noticed that the mother of all things had appeared before him at some unknown time. Martha's face was filled with a sacred smile. She looked at him but did not directly answer the question. Do you understand the meaning of the throne, my child? Brando was a little at a loss. Martha smiled gently and continued. My child, you must understand that in that eternal war we are not immortal. And one day when the gods pass away one by one, everything we protect will meet the destined end in that era. Destined? Brando frowned. Lady Martha, if everything is destined, then what is the meaning of all these wars? You said that amber is the sword of fate for mortals. Can it really let us control our own fate? Martha also smiled and shook her head at the answer to this question. She only replied, "Our world has been destroyed and reborn again and again. But everything is not unchanged, my child. Although the ending of each war is repeated, like a knot that cannot be untied, but under such circumstances the bronze race was born. The bronze race. They have left us, my child, but that is inevitable." Martha's voice was calm and steady. In the darkness, the rusty clockwork is returning to its original position. Because, from the beginning, they have already pointed to a path to victory. What? Brando was a little surprised. He had only heard of the bronze race's betrayal, but he had never heard of such a thing. Martha seemed to have expected his surprise and continued. In that era, I saw a kind of hope in the bronze race. Perhaps there is such a path that allows us to coexist with the will of this world. Our goal is not to destroy everything but to protect this new home. So this is... Brendel suddenly understood something when he heard this. Yes, this is the beginning of the era of mortals. Mortals born of iron were born. My child, this is the era you see. Brando fell silent and did not speak for a long time. It was not until a few minutes later that he spoke again. However, the Twilight Dragon did not weaken because of this. Instead, the gods and ancestors left this world one by one. In our era, the power of mortals is so weak. Where is our hope? How can we defeat the Twilight Dragon? He raised his head and looked into Martha's eyes. Those deep silver eyes were full of praise. Martha slowly walked to Brando's side, reached out her hand and placed it on his forehead. Brando could not feel the physical touch of her hand, but he could feel a faint warmth. You should understand, Brando, my child. The Twilight Dragon is not the will of this world itself. It only represents the hostility and destruction of this world. When the conflict between the old and new order is inevitable, it is born. So when everything ends, it is the time of the Twilight Dragon's demise, my child. And everything? Martha's silver eyes fell on him and looked at him quietly. The Twilight Dragon understood in the Wars of the Four Eras that it must seize the highest authority of the Tiamat law, the Amber Sword. Only then can it completely end everything, our world. For this reason, it did not hesitate to project its body into the network of Tiamat. It descended into this world in a physical form and occupied the body of the Roman lady. Because it already knew of the divine people's plan, and through the Bronze Tribe's betrayal, it stole the most important part of the plan. Through its own ingenious arrangements, it allowed the outcome of the Sixth War to proceed in the direction it wanted. Until today, when this moment has arrived, Brando stared blankly at Martha, looking at the mother of all things. You? He asked in a daze. You already knew? Martha nodded silently. Because from the beginning the gods actually had two plans. Brando opened his mouth slightly. Their first plan was called the Throne of Destiny. In this plan, the gods used the bloodline of the ancestors to create the Roman lady. When the Roman lady grew up, she could use the Amber Sword to restart our world and let everything return to the beginning. And that era will be the beginning of the next war. But this plan is actually just a cover, Martha replied shockingly. The real plan is actually the Wone plan, which is the curved surface plan. This plan is the beginning of the end of everything. That is, when the Twilight Dragon descended into the law of Tiamat through our first plan and obtained a physical existence through the Roman lady, it was indeed the moment it was closest to victory. However, at the same time, it also exposed its greatest weakness. Because, as the owner of the bloodline of the ancestors, it will become one with our world. It will become one of the highest authorities in this world, but it is also a part of this network. Martha stared at Brando and asked word by word, "Do you know what the throne means, my child?" Brando shut his mouth, his heart moved. The Twilight Dragon will never understand what the throne means because it lacks the emotions of a mortal, so it will never be able to win this war. Martha shook her head gently. This era, she replied, is an era where the gods have left the world and the stars have fallen to the earth. And on the earth, the mortals born in the Black Iron will control their own fate and future. That will be a new era. Above the mortals, there will no longer be authority above them. And after that, we will no longer be able to determine the fate of these people. Perhaps for this world, it is time to loosen its remaining shackles. Brando, Martha asked softly, the era you see, our dreams and hopes, has it been realized? Has it arrived? Brando shook his head gently. On the earth there were still the gold and silver races. The legacy of the gods still determined the future and fate of Wond. There were also existences like him and the Silver Queen, who held the highest authority in this world. It even had deep traces of the previous era. The order left by the Planeswalkers still existed. Even the Planeswalkers themselves had not completely left. And the fire of divinity had never been born from mortals. Did mortals really control their own fate? Perhaps this is my question as well. Because the answer to this question is without a doubt no. So the Twilight Dragon still exists, Martha replied softly. My child, do you understand? Brando was silent for a moment. He reached out and held his mother's hand on his forehead. That hand was heavy, as if it was the crown she promised him. Mother, what should we do? If you want to wear the crown, you must bear its weight, my child. Brando raised his head, somewhat stunned. Martha looked at him and slowly narrated, I was born with the highest authority, my child. From the moment I was born, I created a network called Tiamat in this world. When all the laws descended, elements and magic each had their own duties. Thus, the world called Wond was born. But our world was born with the highest authority. All its authority and power also came from there. Therefore, only those above the throne can destroy the throne itself. And the Twilight Dragon will not know that there is another person in this world who can also pick up the holy sword Amber, the highest authority in this world. Brando pursed his lips tightly. He even closed his eyes as if he had already expected this. Martha looked at him with a somewhat gentle gaze. Brando, my child, I have chosen a hero from the unseen world. He has such a special quality. Only he can bear such a heavy responsibility. He will end everything in the past and put the final end to this never-ending war. But, after a long time, Brando opened his eyes again. Why me? Martha looked at him and gestured for him to raise his head. She pointed at the scene in front of them. When Brando saw that scene, he felt as if all the blood in his body was rushing to his brain. Because he saw a young man. The young man's upper body was naked and his eyes were closed. His body was contained in a metal culture tank, and his whole body was wrapped in a translucent liquid. In front of the young man, there were 3 tall men in long robes. Brando stared at the rings on their hands. The head and tail of the Ouroboros coiled around each other, shining brightly. That's me? The face that should be called Sophie seemed so unfamiliar to Brando at this moment. Martha nodded. I have used all the authority of cell nuclei 4 to 13, mobilized almost all the remaining energy in the Tiamat Law Network, and built a game called The Amber Sword in your world through the causality of time and space, and did not hesitate to disturb the flow of time in the future to reproduce part of Wond's history in front of your eyes. I have chosen some people, but only you have successfully come to our world. I can feel the obsession in your heart, Brando. Perhaps it is your love for some people and things and for Erwin that resonates with this world enough. Brando sighed softly. What is a cell nucleus? It is the collective name of the 36 satellites in low Earth orbit of Wond, which is also my body. Are all the gods like this? Brando recalled the spectacular scene he saw outside the elemental boundary of Tiamat and asked. Martha nodded. Then what about senior sister? Miss Maynard was also a part of this plan, but the child was not completely successful. Perhaps you will have a chance to see her in the future and bring my apologies to her. Then I came to this world and got the identity of Brando. Was it also arranged by you? Brando hesitated for a moment and finally asked this question. Martha looked at him and answered softly. You have lived for 140 years in our era. In that era, Odin and Gaia taught you many things. After you died, we preserved your memories and created another embryo. That is the current you, Brando, my child. You don't have to doubt your identity, she put down her hand. You are Brando, the grandson of the Earth Sword Saint, a Highland Knight, and the heir of the Cardoloso family. But when everything came, your past memories recovered themselves and returned to you again. You are Sophie and also Brando. Brando was silent. He seemed to have returned to that summer night a few years ago. At that time, at this moment, he silently said to himself, Yes, I am Sophie and also Brando. Then allow me to ask one last question, Lady Martha. Martha looked at him and nodded in tacit agreement. Why did you project the curved surface project into our era? And where did the ancestors come from? And why do we have the highest level of authority in the Tiamat network? At this point, Brando raised his head. He saw Martha's silver eyes flickering with a gentle luster. Because you and the ancestors have the same bloodline, Brando. It is not contaminated by the laws of this world at all. The first generation of people who came here, They should have had another name. Their homeland was once called Earth. Chapter 1427. Delphian? Miss Delphian. The distant voice seemed to come from another world, faintly discernible. The Prime Minister's daughter slowly opened her eyes. Her eyes were as deep and beautiful as an amethyst. The first thing she saw was the slightly dazzling sunlight passing through the shade of the trees. It was the sun afternoon, and it dyed the layers of leaves in light yellow and tender green. The veins of the branches and leaves were clearly visible under the sunlight, and the dull and monotonous sound of insects echoed in the forest. She frowned as if she was recalling something, but soon her face showed a palpitating expression. Delphine gasped softly and blinked her eyes. Then she saw the pair of eyes that were staring at her not far away. "My lord. Are you okay?" Brando looked at Delphian, whose face was as pale as if she had just been fished out of the water. He noticed that she subconsciously curled up, and could not help but wonder if she had just woken up from a nightmare. "Can you help me up, my lord?" Brando looked at her for a moment and nodded. He reached out and held her shoulder, helping her up and sitting her on a rock. Delphian's body was almost soaked in sweat, and her face was pale as if she had just recovered from a serious illness. She only looked up and stared at the former in a daze. Brando was a little uncomfortable under her gaze, and could not help but lower his head to avoid the latter's gaze. The first thing he saw was the girl's snow-white slender neck. The dazzling white skin was slightly translucent under the sunlight, and the capillaries below were clearly visible. "Do I look good?" Delphian suddenly asked faintly. "Ahem, I still don't understand." "What don't you understand?" Brando was stunned. "I don't understand what you're thinking." "Me? My lord, don't tell me you're not moved at all?" Delphian looked into Brando's eyes, and her eyes were a little blurred. "I've been your mistress for a long time, haven't I?" She raised her hand and stopped Brando from speaking. "I understand. My lord is so afraid of me because I am a vicious woman, right?" Brando frowned. He could faintly hear a hint of depression in Delphian's tone. He rarely saw the Prime Minister's daughter like this. "No, Miss Delphian, I understand. That's pity and some guilt. You want to pity me and give me alms. Because you took my body, you want to be responsible for me, right?" Brando froze slightly. Delphian lightly shook her head, her purple eyes revealing a deep light. "How laughable. Actually, if we were in the Empire, I would definitely not fall for a coward like you. My lord, Alman is 1,000 times more resolute and cold-blooded than you. This is why I chose him." Brando couldn't help but feel a little unhappy when this woman described him like this. Although he didn't care about some of her values and opinions, he was still a man after all. Seeing Brando's expression, the Prime Minister's daughter's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise. "It seems that I have angered you, my lord." "No, Miss Delphian. Even if there is someone who is 1,000 times colder than me, it is not worthy of my envy. In fact, it is the opposite." Brando would never admit that he was jealous before. Delphian suddenly sighed. "Yes, it is indeed not worthy of your envy." Brando was stunned. "Because one by one they have become a thing of the past. Just like me, the empire of the past has fallen apart. What is left of everything I have pursued?" Delphian faintly asked herself. "Perhaps the truly laughable one is a woman like me who does not know herself." Brando saw her downcast expression and faintly felt something in his heart. He knew that what she had seen and heard these days had affected her. After all, she was just an ordinary person. Even if she was the eldest daughter of the Prime Minister's family, how could her original knowledge and schemes surpass the class she represented? It was at this moment that he suddenly realized that the most precious treasure that his 2 lifetimes had left him might not be the highest authority known as the system. Instead, it was the vision that allowed him to not be limited by history and the present, allowing him to directly see through the future and the confusion. Everyone in this world was bound and shackled by their own fate and what they had seen and heard, but he was already standing at the intersection of history and the future. Because he had once witnessed the arrival of such an era with his own eyes. That was the past, present, and future. They had no secrets in his eyes. Thus in the Dark Age a king descended. Everything he knew, the world had no secrets in his eyes. And perhaps this was the most important treasure that Martha had not hesitated to disturb the flow of time to pass on to the winners. Brando could not help but unconsciously let go of his palm. There, in his palm, was a ball of light that emitted a faint green light. It shone, verdant like a dream, and the light flowed in his palm. Delphian was attracted by the light. She looked up and stared at the ball of light in Brando's hand. "This is the nature pearl?" Brando nodded. "Lady Martha gave it to you?" Brando nodded again. He could not help but recall the scene at that time. After Martha softly answered all of this, the space quieted down. It was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Brando felt his mind in a mess. He could not speak for a long time. The people of God were earthlings, so as a pure earthling, everything seemed to have a reasonable explanation. After a while he stammered, "So, I'm the only person who has the highest authority other than the Roman?" Martha nodded gently. She said softly, "So do you understand, my child? Now you will become the only hope in this world. Until that day, Won's fate will depend on your choice." Martha's voice was as gentle and peaceful as ever, but Brando frowned. "I don't understand, Lady Martha, I don't understand. Since the Azure Age, didn't the gods leave the world to create an era that belonged to the mortals? Amber is the holy sword that the mortals control, but if the survival of the world is still in the hands of one person, how can it be called our self-salvation? If," he could not help but raise his voice, "if one day this world no longer has such a savior, where will the mortals go? In that era, who will fight against the Twilight Dragon? If this is the future we foresee, then what's the meaning of its existence? Madame Marcia, could it be that everything we did was just to return everything back to square one?" Brando was suddenly at a loss. If this world only needed a supreme king, a savior, then what was the difference between his choice and that of the Silver Queen? What right did he have to accuse the Silver Queen of doing everything wrong? What was the meaning of the Darkness Dragon Odin, the four sages, and the sacrifices of countless predecessors? No, perhaps all of this should not be like this. He could not help but raise his head, as if wanting to get an answer from the face of the mother of all things. However, Martha just looked at him and smiled slightly. "This is very good, my child." She suddenly raised her hands, and in her palms was a crown of light. "This is really very good. Perhaps one day you will remember what you said today." At? Martha gently interrupted him. "Brando, you have to understand that for this war, it has just begun. A mere Akentu is nothing. The crisis is far from over. The Twilight Dragon already understands that this is just a trap, and I have never placed the throne of destiny here. And when it turns its attention to Wond, this war will truly descend. Even if its body is still sealed by the mortal sages, it still has thousands of claws. Find the throne of destiny before the Twilight Dragon, use the key of destiny and open the path to the future. Who will dictate the fate of mortals?" Martha's gaze was both gentle and sentimental. "Brando, it will be left to you to choose for yourselves." "Lady Martha." She had already gently lowered her hands. "Brando, my child, perhaps one day you will become a king. On that day I will crown you in the clouds. You will bathe in the mountains, and all the voices of the world, all the people and all the countries will call you king. Your throne will be above the flame of destiny at the peak of the ancient sages. You will be the one and only ruler of this scepter, the master of all the worlds and the king of Wond. When that day comes, Brando, please follow the voice in your heart. At that moment you will understand everything." Brando raised his head and watched as Martha gently lowered the crown, letting him feel the heavy weight of the crown. "Remember my words, child." Martha's tone was unprecedentedly serious. "If you want to wear the crown, you must bear its weight." She gently lowered her hands and looked at him one last time. Then, the mother of all worlds and all things slowly turned around and walked forward. "Lady Martha." Brando trembled slightly as if he understood something. "My child, farewell forever. From now on, the fate of the world will be tied to you." Martha smiled slightly. She seemed to have walked into a white light. Her figure gradually moved further and further away in the light, finally turning into scattered light spots. Brando looked at this scene in a daze, and in that light he seemed to see many people and things. They slowly came to his side and said goodbye to him one by one. "Do you still remember me, Sophie? I am Crystal, we will never meet again. Little one, do you understand now? What is the origin blood?" The man laughed. "It is just the blood of the dark god, what is it to you?" He patted him on the shoulder. "Take good care of the Roman and take responsibility as a man." Finally, a girl with long green hair that reached her ankles came in front of him and looked at him quietly. "Sophie, I know you have forgotten the days we spent together, but do not forget the ideals and beliefs of the Truth Symposium. Take good care of yourself." "Goddess Gaia." Brando blurted out. But he immediately shut his mouth, and looked at the woman who suddenly stood in front of him with some surprise. Princess Magadal? Why don't you call me Project 13? The woman who looked like the nun princess had an unruly smile on her face. She shook her head and replied, "But forget it, it is all in the past anyway. Besides, this project itself is just a cover-up. You are. Brando suddenly reacted. Tell her to forget about me. The woman smiled. I only want her to be happy. The woman bowed to him. Project 13, I bid you farewell, Mr. Sophie. One by one the figures disappeared. The space seemed to have become quiet again. Brando looked up, only to see the light spots in the sky falling between his shoulders and hands. He subconsciously raised his hands and gathered a ball of light in his palms. The ball of light flickered. Verdant like a dream. Chapter 1428. Brando came back to his senses in a daze. He stared at the nature orb in his hand that was emitting a soft light and glow. He turned his head and found that Delphien's gaze had fallen on his face. What's wrong? Nothing, Sir Lord. Delphien shook her head gently and looked away, but there was still a clear sense of loneliness between her eyebrows. Brando could not help but sigh. Although the thoughts of the Prime Minister's daughter were extreme, she was also a victim. Moreover, in comparison, although she had plotted many things behind the scenes, there were not many people who really suffered because of it. Compared to the Silver Queen's coldness that caused countless people to fall into the flames of war and disaster, it was better to say that it was just a kind of willfulness and paranoia. To be honest, the only one who was really blamed because of her was the Roman. However, what happened to the merchant lady was inevitable. Brando was actually very clear in his heart that the Twilight Dragon's plan for several generations would not be changed by a mere mortal. In fact, he was already clear about all this in his heart, but when Delphien brought up this matter again in a contemptuous tone, he could not help but feel angry. Are you really okay? Brando asked. Do you want to rest? No need. Delphien hesitated for a moment. It was just a dream. A dream? Yes. I dreamed of some things when I was young. She forced a smile, her eyes full of nostalgia. Sir Lord, I lived in Lowen Castle before I was 5 years old. It was in the suburbs of South Bancal, and it was my father's territory. When I was young, I was the leader of the children. I had a group of friends. Most of them were orphans adopted by the Silver Lily Association's orphanage. Do you know the Silver Lily Association? Brando was slightly surprised. Commoners? Delphien nodded. Surprised? Do you think that I, the daughter of a noble family, would lower myself to mingle with commoners? It's a little hard to tell. Brando replied. He was well aware of the strict hierarchy of the Cruz Empire. The nobles rarely interacted with the commoners, let alone make friends. The descendants of the nobles were even more strict in their upbringing. They would usually be taught by an outstanding lady before they reached adulthood, and they would not mix with the children of the commoners. Not to mention the commoners, even the ordinary small nobles would not be able to enter their eyes. In fact, he only needed to look back at his first encounter with Vahina to know how prideful and domineering the little princess was. If it were someone else, Brando might have been able to believe it a little. But when he looked at Delphien, he couldn't believe that the daughter of the Prime Minister, who always acted with strict aristocratic etiquette, was such a deviant person. If my father and grandfather knew about this, I'm afraid they would fly into a rage. I'm afraid it's not as simple as just flying into a rage. Brando thought to himself. What kind of family was the Nidvins in the Empire? What kind of status did the old Prime Minister have in the Empire? If he knew that his eldest granddaughter, the eldest daughter of the family, mingled with a bunch of filthy poor boys all day long, there would be an earthquake in the Nidvins family. He asked, So, you dreamt of what happened back then? Brando never thought that his casual question would make Delphien cry in a daze. He watched as 2 lines of crystal tears rolled down the Prime Minister's daughter's face. Brando was stunned. Ever since he had met the Prime Minister's daughter, no matter how much damage she had suffered, even when she was almost disfigured by the dragon flame that day, although she was hysterical, he had never seen her lose control of her emotions like this. Miss Delphien? My lord, do you think that a person who betrays her beliefs and vows is really worth saving? Delphien suddenly asked. After my 5th birthday, I had to go to Mehodafen. Before I left, I went to see my companions for the last time. I remember it was in a barn. I swore to each and every one of them that one day I would definitely come back to see them. I would never forget my promise and my companions just because my identity had changed. Just like any other tomboy, I bumped fists with Rowan, and Demi gave me her favorite straw doll. Delphien clenched her fists tightly. Brando saw that her knuckles had turned white, and her nails were almost digging into her flesh to the point of drawing blood. But I forgot everything. This shameless, vicious woman forgot all her vows and her companions. When she returned to Loyan once again, the disaster of Cloak Bay. Brando sighed slightly. He had already understood everything. It was a riot that happened in the year 358 of the First Era. 37 years after the end of the Second Holy War in the Year of the Stars, and 18 years after the Great Purge in the eastern Metz region, Cloak Bay and the surrounding areas experienced continuous droughts and locust plagues. However, the Empire at that time issued a new law and increased the taxes on the area. The next spring, under the instigation of the dissatisfied pagans left after the Great Purge, large-scale refugee riots broke out in Loyan, Bangalore, Kalas, and other areas. However, the riots quickly attracted the suppression of the Empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. According to historical records, after the suppression, these areas were turned into rivers of blood, and the countryside became a wilderness. It was not until the Year of the Pillar that they gradually regained their vitality. But whose fault was this? Brando thought. As a child, it was naturally easy for her to throw some things to the back of her mind. But one day, when she once again remembered her promise and returned to her childhood hometown, she discovered that everything had changed beyond recognition. In your dreams, did you dream of those scenes in the past? Brando asked. Delphian took a soft breath and suddenly became silent. She silently wiped away her tears, and with great difficulty she regained control of her emotions and replied faintly, "In the year 279 of the First Era, the year of the harvest, the Empire issued a law, the Treaty of Helasto. According to the law, the tax reform was reformulated, and the farmers in the provinces of the Empire were exempted from religious taxes and 13 other miscellaneous taxes. That was the follow-up of the reform in the year of the Golden Glory." Brando looked at the girl and replied softly, "It was the reform presided over by your grandfather. In this reform, the main thing was to deprive the Holy Cathedral of Fire of control over the farmers, and reduce the exploitation of the farmers. Not long after that, the Empire entered the so-called 20 years of prosperity, which was also the beginning of the glorious era." The Prime Minister's daughter silently raised her head to look at him, her purple eyes showing a hint of surprise. "In the year 331 of the First Era, my grandfather left the political scene of the Empire. Because of the backlash from the Holy Cathedral and the old aristocratic forces, the Treaty of Helasto was immediately abolished. But in the new French that was inherited, most of the provisions of the treaty were inherited. That was because Her Majesty the Queen had not yet stabilized her position and did not want to see the Holy Cathedral rise again. As far as I know, the new French was actually the product of the struggle and compromise between the two sides." Brando pondered for a moment, slightly puzzled. He did not understand why Delphian would suddenly mention this. But the good times did not last long. Her Majesty soon showed her strong side. With the support of the dragons and the Bugas, she quickly grew her wings, and the Holy Cathedral was no longer her opponent. At this time, she wanted to make a move on the entrenched aristocratic political forces of the Empire. Delphian replied coldly, "She first supported the Palate family, and then promulgated the Turnipani French. This French was in fact born to eliminate my grandfather's influence in the political scene of the Empire and suppress the Nidevan family." Hearing this, Brando suddenly understood what she was going to say. The Prime Minister's daughter's eyes were slightly red. The next year, according to this French, the Empire imposed heavy taxes on the Loyan, Bangalore, and Kalas regions. This tax was nominally to supplement the expenses of the Imperial Navy's new docks, but in fact, Her Majesty suppressed the Nidevan family and gave the Cecil family a sweetener, in order to support Her Majesty's motion for the Palate family to be enfeoffed. That year, there was a continuous drought and locust plague in the northern part of Cloak Bay. According to the traditions of the Empire, the taxes in the region should have been reduced. But Her Majesty's struggle with the old aristocratic political forces was at a white-hot stage, so she would never compromise at this time. After 4 months, the taxes in the Loyan, Bangalore, and Kalas regions increased. At this point, Delphian fell silent. In the spring of the year 359, I received a letter in Lais. After that, I secretly went to Kalas, but I did not have time to see Rowan for the last time. Their army had run out of ammunition and food in the hills north of Cloak Bay. When I arrived, they had already been besieged and annihilated by General Mangrove. After a long period of silence, the young girl's voice sounded calmly. "After that, I made a vow. One day, I will definitely repeat the reforms of the Golden Glory year and fulfill my grandfather's long-cherished wish. I will re-implement the Treaty of Helasto that my grandfather abolished, but to do so, I understand that I have to restore the influence the Nidevan family had on the Empire in its heyday." Brando looked at her, but his heart was heavy. He had never thought that this stubborn young lady would have such lofty ideals in her heart. However, she had chosen the wrong path. The reason the Naidevan family was able to reach their current position in history was purely because of the game between royal authority and religious authority. He had fulfilled the long-cherished wish of Emperor Grantity the Great and became an indispensable part of the three pillars of the empire during that era. As a result, he had been an extremely prominent official for his entire life, and the Naidevan family had also shaken the empire. Chapter 1429. However, as the times changed, the conflict between the church and the nobles shifted from the church to the nobles. The decline of the House of Naidevan became an unavoidable historical fact. On this point, Old Naidevan and Little Naidevan probably had a tacit understanding. Little Naidevan's mediocrity was just a result of his father being like a dog, or was it some sort of self-preservation choice? Perhaps only the people involved could understand. The so-called reforms in the Golden Year, the Treaty of Halasto, and the enactment of the French laws that followed were just external manifestations of the struggle between the nobles. From the very beginning they had walked on the wrong path. Brando could only imagine what Delphian would encounter. "So," he asked after a moment of silence, "when you realized that you couldn't do all of this, you chose the path of marriage? That is indeed one way, but Miss Delphian, have you thought of another point?" Marriage was the most traditional and effective method in the nobles' politics. Delphian's choice of Elman's house was indeed a good choice. Elman was a rising star in the empire's political scene, and he was indeed very capable. However, as a woman, it was hard to say who would be the leader in the House of Elman if Delphian married into the House of Elman. Needless to say, she might even lose her influence over the Naidevan family, or at least a part of it. Delphian smiled sadly. "Mr. Brando, sometimes I think that perhaps it's not a bad thing to be a little naive. At least she won't be so complicated to the point where she loses herself and even forgets her original intentions. Everything I pursued was built on a castle in the air, and in the end it all came to nothing. I lied to myself and didn't want to wake up from this dream. I was intoxicated in the lies of power and desire. I told myself that I could do it, but I knew that was only self-deception. I couldn't do it and they were far beyond my reach. I was just a complete failure, Mr. Brando, but I couldn't bear to give up even a little bit of power in my hands. I'm a fallen and sinful woman. I've long forgotten my original intentions and my vows, just like how I've forgotten my companions. I'm used to currying favor and scheming in the circle of nobles. What lofty ideals. They've long left me. That's just a lie. I hate you so much. I hate you for ruining my plans and killing my lover. I was hysterical, but it was just a ridiculous performance of a person whose lies were exposed. In your eyes, I must be a madwoman, a clown because I am a madwoman, a poisonous woman who doesn't deserve anyone's sympathy." She lowered her head and sparkling tears fell, soaking the corners of her clothes. "Mr. Brando, this vicious woman has told too many lies, but in front of Mother, all filth and dirt can't be hidden. She is just a sinner and doesn't ask for your forgiveness. But at least before she leaves, she wants to tell you everything." "Leave?" Brando grabbed her wrist. "You've also seen Lady Martha?" The Prime Minister's daughter struggled silently. Her pale face was like a withered flower in the wind, but Brando already understood everything. "Mother will forgive anyone," Brando said softly. "Miss Delphian, because we are all her children. In a person's life, it's inevitable that everyone will misjudge some people and do some wrong things. But people are not saints who can be faultless. However, when you realize your mistake, perhaps the first thing you think of is not to be negative and avoid it, but to face it. It's like a bloody scar, but it will heal eventually. You shouldn't wait for it to fester and worsen, to make up for it and face your past. Face it." Delphian's face was pale and she shook her head weakly. "It's easier said than done. Everyone should pay the price for everything they have done. Now Her Majesty is sleeping in her dreams, and the empire is falling apart. All of this is the anger of revenge, and now I'm about to be judged." "Who's going to judge you, Miss Delphian?" Brando asked impatiently. "Who did you hurt? Will the poor victim wake up from the grave when the murderer is on the gallows? Yes, the empire is falling apart now and the murderer has received the punishment he deserves, but so what? Thousands of people who suffered the same fate as your companions are now homeless, suffering from hunger and pain. When the empire was still around, they were not clothed, had nowhere to live, and were even blinded by evil and darkness. But today? Have their lives become better? No, they are still the most miserable group of people. Miss Delphian, now that the Twilight Dragon has washed away all the dust of the past on the empire, you can help them build a new empire on the ruins. This new cruise will follow the glory of the ancient kings, and it will realize the glory of the past. And this, Brando roared at her, is your dream. Now are you going to betray it again? The Prime Minister's daughter was completely stunned. She seemed to have never seen this side of Brando. Oh, how is it possible to do such a thing? Of course it can be done, Brando said loudly. If we can even defeat the Twilight Dragon, then what's the point of rebuilding a world on the wasteland it left behind? But, what if we can't defeat it? Brando smiled faintly. Then we can only die, but at least we are like-minded and can sleep together with the brave people. The Prime Minister's daughter seemed to be struck by lightning, and her eyes flashed with an indescribable light. After a long time, she woke up again, and the blurred light in her purple eyes gradually dissipated. Silently, she looked at Brando again. Are you comforting me, Sir Lord? You can say that. Brando sighed, and his mood was a little complicated. Delphian gently tucked the hair in front of her forehead, lowered her head and softly replied, Thank you, Sir Lord, although it sounds really stupid. What? Brando was stunned. You should hug me or kiss me and not comfort me so lightly. You don't understand a woman's heart at all, Sir Lord. Huh? Brando wondered what the hell was going on, but at least he understood that the Prime Minister's daughter had finally recovered. Then where is this place and where is Miss Huanghua and the others? Delphian asked after wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Brando straightened up and looked around. They were in the middle of a lush forest. The midday sun shone through the shade of the trees, sprinkling golden spots of light on the fallen withered tree trunks. They could vaguely see the deep and serene scenery of the dense forest in the distance, where the branches and vines were overgrown and the vines hung down. Naturally, this was not a scene that existed in the stagnation realm. Lady Martha might have sent them outside, but they did not know if they were still in the green sea. This is an island? Brando shook his head. At least he did not hear the sound of waves nearby, but perhaps this place was far from the coast. We haven't met Huanghua yet, but we met Lu Te and Mr. Lu Wu before that. We have already split up and searched in different directions. It seems that everyone should not be too far away. So Sir Lord did not spend much time to find me? Brando nodded. Do you still need to rest? He glanced at Delphian, who did not seem to be in a very good state, and asked. But the Prime Minister's daughter just shook her head. No, but I am afraid I will have to trouble Sir Lord to help me up. Brando's premonition was very accurate. He thought that if Martha had sent them here, then the others should not be too far away. After all, the latter was not an unreliable guy like Bai. Sure enough, not long after he supported Delphian, they met the two sisters Ling and Lien in a clearing in the forest. The two sisters had not yet woken up, and the two of them were lying together on a snow-white rock. After a brief examination, Brando found that there were no bruises or abrasions on their bodies. Obviously, all of this was the doing of the mother of all things. Soon after, the little fairy Lu Te, who had split up to search for the others, brought back Huanghua and Fang Qi. When Her Royal Highness saw Brando, she was obviously relieved. She bowed respectfully to Brando and said, Master, Huanghua is back. Listening to the gentle and peaceful greeting, Brando felt warm in his heart. He took a closer look at his student and could not help but be a little surprised. Huanghua, your inheritance? Huanghua nodded calmly. Master, Huanghua has obtained all the inheritance of the Desert Wind swordsmanship. Lady Martha told me that all 9 swords were born from the sacred sword Verdant. The inheritance of the Red Lotus is hidden in the natural pearl. This is the mystery of jade. The mystery of the emerald is actually one with the 7 keys. That is to say, only the person who can open the door can truly solve this mystery, Lute said excitedly. So, when people are seeking to solve the mystery of the emerald is actually choosing the person it likes. Mr. Brendel, you are indeed the person that Miss Tada likes. Yes. Huanghua also looked at her teacher with some admiration. She bowed and said, Huanghua can be where I am today because of Master's kindness. If one day Huanghua will not dare to forget. Brendel hurriedly supported her, but the moment he moved, Fang Qi, who was beside him, had already knelt down respectfully in front of him and gave him a big bow. Brando was shocked, but he heard Fang Qi say, Mr. Brando, the kindness of teaching you is like a father to me. Fang Qi has offended you, please forgive him. Fang Qi, what are you doing? Master, Fang Qi obtained the supreme inheritance of the Iron Heart swordsmanship because of you. Now he is only a step away from the celestial realm. Huanghua said, according to the tradition of the 9 phoenixes, to him, you are equivalent to a teacher. You deserve his bow. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. He looked at this nine-phoenix genius. Who would have thought that this usually arrogant guy would have such a side? Chapter 1430. Princess Magadol was the last to speak, and her voice was a little soft. But a hand was placed on the back of her hand, and the princess looked back in surprise, but saw the calm face of the Prime Minister's daughter. Swear on this. She was like a competent maid and finished her oath to her lord. Yeah. Lotus seemed to have done something big, and she was so excited that she waved her fist, and even her glasses almost fell off the bridge of her nose, scaring her into holding them. The little fairy Lute sat on the little girl's shoulder, and also looked a little excited. This must be the moment to witness history, it thought to itself. The Prime Minister's daughter turned back at this time and looked at Brando. She lowered her head slightly and said in a hoarse voice, I heard that Prince Leneret is still alive, my lord. Although I don't know if this news is true or not, at least it shows that some of the Empire's top officials survived the war. The Battle of Metz only affected the northeast of the Empire and the Ludwig area. Although the elite part of the Empire was destroyed, it still has vitality, and the Red Army in the wilderness of the Four Territories should still be intact. Delphian, you want to? Brando was stunned. Delphian nodded silently. I have to return to the Empire, my lord. Although it seems that they have realized the seriousness of the problem, or there would not be this meeting. But they may not know everything that happened here in Madara, and more importantly, you, my lord. Brando was silent. He knew his importance in this war. Besides the Twilight Dragon itself, only he could hold the only key, but to find the throne of destiny, his strength alone was far from enough, and he had to borrow the strength of the four empires. But at this moment he did not have such a position. You do, my lord? Delphian seemed to read his mind and whispered, Have you forgotten, my lord, the Silver Queen had personally put the crown that only belonged to the Empire on your head, and this is the most important legal basis. My grandfather, my father, and Vala also personally received the ring that represents the supreme royal power from Her Majesty, and they all know who is the true successor. But Leneret is still alive, Brando replied. I have no reason to take his throne. You don't have to take his throne. You are the king of Wond, the only king in the Dark Prophecy, the successor of the Dark Dragon in this era, and you are the Lord of Destiny chosen by Martha. Delphian shook her head. Why would you care about the mortal throne when your divinity descends? You are the king of kings, the god of gods, and the kings of the world are just your subjects. But now you still need the support of the Crown Prince, my grandfather, and the Holy See of Vala. If they understand your importance, they will make a wise decision. The Prime Minister's daughter replied seriously, So I have to return to the Empire. There is not much time left for us. But your safety? Brando frowned. It was not that he did not think of letting Delphian return to the Empire. After all, her grandfather and father were still in the Empire, and he did not know whether they were alive or dead, but he originally planned to take her back to Erewhon first, and then send someone to send her back. I can go with Miss Magadol, she is enough to protect me. But what about after reaching Silver Bay? The journey from Silver Bay to the wilderness of Four Territories is not short. Just let Mr. Lute come with me. He can be considered one of the top experts in the human world. Brando thought about it and felt that it was not a bad idea, so he nodded. He had just asked Lute for his opinion, and the little fairy himself did not seem to care, although he would rather go with Brando to Erewhon to see the legendary Land of Promise. But he also knew that Delphian's proposal was indeed the best choice in the current situation. Mr. Brando was the person chosen by Lady Martha, and in any case, this matter was the most important. That was what Lute thought in his heart. Then Brando asked the sisters Lien and Ling for their opinions. The two sisters planned to return to Lantern Island, so Brando could only bring them along, and fortunately the journey was not too long. At this time, the fleet of the merchant group that was going to the Nine Phoenixes sounded. This was the sound of the fleet preparing to lift the anchor and leave the port. Brando knew in his heart that the time to leave had finally come. He looked at his student, and Mr. Lu Huanghua was also looking in this direction. She bowed deeply to Brando. Teacher, take care. Brando saw his student biting her lower lip, silently turning around. Her eyes were clearly a little red, recalling the little things that they had spent together these days. He could not help but feel a little bitter in his heart. We will meet again, Mr. Brando. Mr. Lu and Fang Chi saluted him at the same time. Brando nodded, silently watching the three figures disappear into the crowd. Not long after, Magadol, Lute and the Prime Minister's daughter also bid farewell and left. Before leaving, Delphian took a deep look at him. That pair of purple eyes seemed to contain countless complex emotions. The two fleets left the port one after another. Brando watched the sail gradually disappear under the horizon, and after Flofa left with Alaz, although the port was still bustling, noisy and chaotic, but in this inconspicuous corner, this small group had become scattered and sparsely populated. Brando sighed for a moment, then turned back, looked at the two sisters, Ling and Lien, and could not help but shake his head with a bitter smile. I don't know when I will see Mr. Lute again. Lien also looked a little melancholy, but after all she was just a little girl. Her emotions came and went quickly, and soon she looked up and asked curiously, Mr. Brando, are we going back to Erewhon next? Brando nodded. Yes, your hometown is in Porchenier? We were born in Randner, Mr. Brendel. But my sister and I don't remember where we were born. For as long as we can remember, we grew up in the Church of the Silver Lilies in Porchenier. Speaking of which, I really miss my companions. According to the age of humans, they must have grown up by now, right? Lotus said with some anticipation. Maybe some of them have already formed families? Brendel smiled when he heard this, then glanced at the silent Ling, thinking that the personality difference between the two sisters was a little too big. Porchenier, he replied. I suddenly remembered that it was Yak's chassis. Yak. That's the son of the Duke of Lantanailan. He should be your lord. I know the Duke of Lantanailan, but I've never heard of him having a son. Was the little lord born after my sister and I left? That's not it, but that's a long story. Brendel chuckled. Since the First War of the Black Rose, Karsuk and several mountain roads to the east of Buchi had completely fallen into a state of abandonment, especially after the Golden City Lord sealed off a series of the kingdom's entry and exit routes from the Black Wolf Pass to the Icewind Gorge. These places became synonymous with desolation. In fact, in relatively peaceful times, the roads in these mountains were still traversed by caravans. The conflict between Erewhon and Madara was intermittent, but in the world of darkness and light, the profits were several times higher, especially when the contraband goods were transported to the inland areas north of the Sea of the Dying Moon. There were many dark nobles and necromancers who would pay for it. Not to mention that there were also many human residents living in these places. However, even though merchants pursued profits, they still needed to be alive to spend the money they earned. Ever since the First War of the Black Roses, a large number of patrolling troops had been maintained in these areas to capture and execute spies from both sides who had infiltrated the country. So after the first few groups of people were sent to their deaths, the merchants stopped. They understood that to make a fortune on this road, they would lose their heads. They could still take the sea route. Although they would lose a lot of money, at least it was much safer. This situation lasted until the Second War of the Black Rose. In history, because of the fall of Karsuk, Viro, and Buchi, the mountains that were originally the border between the two countries became the heartland of the new empire. The few ports in the north of Viro were closely connected with the ports in Belafé and went directly into the interior of the empire, so these smuggling routes in the past became history. Except for a few adventurers and players who went deep into the mountains, almost no one would pass through here. But in this time and space, the small kingdom of Erewhon won the Second War of the Black Rose in an almost bizarre way. After that, the undead completely withdrew their influence and gave up on this place, causing this area to become more desolate than it was in history. Except for the fact that there were no players in this world, even the adventurers seemed to have completely forgotten about this towering mountain. The reason was very simple. Because since the end of summer, there had been a lot of bad news from the south of Madara. Refugees not only poured into the ports in the north of Madara, but also rushed to the border between Erewhon and Madara. In fact, in this month, according to the statistics of Gold City and Buchi, there were at least tens of thousands of refugees from Madara entering the country. Although the upper echelons of the kingdom were discussing the issue of peace and alliance with Madara, the lords of the various territories did not seem to welcome these uninvited guests from the enemy country. Of course, they sent out troops to seal off the borders. This way, not many people could enter the mountains of Buchi. But obviously today was an exception. Chapter 1431. Port of Belafar. A tall sailboat was leaving the port, its stern drawing a white trail in the bay. The sailors shouted as they lowered the sails, and under the captain's and first mate's commands, the ropes were pulled taut. Brando stood on the damp stone bridge and looked at the port area, only to see the black mass of people fleeing. The news of the goddess of the dead moon betraying Martha and the fall of the realm of eternal death quickly spread here. The local dark nobles and undead had already caught up with the queen's army, and the remaining human refugees rushed over from nearby areas and gathered at the ports of Belafar, Lopez, and Noreo. These people hoped to escape to the Silver Bay or the Grey Mountains, and only a small portion of them would choose Owen. However, very few people were able to find a boat that was willing to take them away, and most of them could only look enviously at those who had a certain amount of wealth leaving with their families. Those who stayed behind could only wait for death. Brando frowned as he looked at the chaotic crowd. The cries of the people at the port were deafening, and he even saw people being pushed off the port. Those who fell into the water struggled in the sea, and although they felt uncomfortable, there was nothing they could do. Compared to the scale of the refugees, Port of Balafor's transport capacity was far from enough. Perhaps the upper echelons of Madara left too heartlessly, but staying behind was also a dead end. The Supreme One with the Mercury Staff made the right decision again with her unique coldness. Princess Magadel's face was filled with pity. They had only arrived at Belafar 3 days ago, and Martha had teleported them to the Evergreen Forest. The forest at the foot of the Tedart Mountains was not too far from Belafar. Belafar was located in the north of Madara, across the Dark Star Sea from the Nitmina Peninsula where Grey Mountain was located. It was Madara's last supply port to Erewhon and Silver Bay. From here to Erewhon, the caravan would only need half a month to travel along the Buchi Mountains. To the east was the Karsuk Plateau controlled by the Highland Knight. This place had always been the gathering point of information in the north of the Sea of the Dying Moon. The refugees from the south had brought all kinds of rumors about the Crystal Cluster and the Undead Army. According to the latest rumors, the Undead Army had turned in the direction of Nauvoo. They had split into two at the Taurus Pass in the north of the Sea of the Dying Moon. One part of them went east while the main force went to the Strait of Tabanya. The Strait of Tabanya was a naturally formed isthmus between Saint Tothole and Madara. It was to the west of the Dark Sea, and it seemed that the Queen of Madara had made up her mind to enter the Grey Mountains from there. As for the one heading east, Brando thought it was likely that they were heading to Erewhon. In addition to the news from the south, some of the fleets that arrived a month ago also brought news from the north. However, the news of the collapse of the Cruz Empire spread like the plague. However, some of the rumors mentioned the peace talks between the Cruz Empire and the Wind Elves in the wilderness of the Four Realms, which was beyond Brando's expectations. It seemed that there were people from the Empire who survived the battle in Metz. He was very worried about the safety of Vahina and Lady Veronica, as well as the priestess of the Leo Palace who always had a straight face, and the Arch-Seigneur Vala. Especially the Arch-Seigneur Vala. After the death of the Silver Queen, Vala became the spiritual and faith pillar of the Empire. If he unfortunately died in the war, the Empire would soon become a pile of loose sand. The loss of one of the four great empires of the humans and the elves would be a heavy blow to the Order faction. However, the truth and falsehood were hidden in the chaos of rumors and rumors, making it impossible to distinguish the truth of the matter. Brando could only give up guessing and wait until he returned to Erewhon. Originally, he did not have to come here to squeeze with the refugees on the limited ships, but Huang Hua, Mr. Liu and Fang Qi had to go to Nine Phoenix, and Princess Magadel had to return to the Duchy of Antiburo, so everyone had to separate here. In fact, the ship had been found a day ago. Huang Hua and the others happened to meet a merchant fleet that was returning to Nine Phoenix. This fleet would go through the Strait of Tabanya to the Red Jade Mountains area, enough to avoid the Tawu Strait route that was cut off by the Lost Names. Princess Magadel, on the other hand, hired a whaling ship to go to Storm Harbor. With her current strength, Brando did not think that the Nun Princess would encounter any trouble on the way. At this time, Brando turned his head and looked at the dragon girl standing beside the little female dragon. It was Flora, but at this moment, the dark silver luster in her eyes had faded, and the golden flame that represented the Golden Clan reignited in the depths of her pupils. Flora was found with Alas 3 days ago. Among the surviving dragons, there was another black dragon named Purr, who had already recovered their consciousness when they were found. Flora was ready to return to Dragon Island, and Alas and another of her kind naturally had to go with her. Although the little female dragon was very reluctant, but after so many things had happened, she could not be so carefree as to wander around outside. On Dragon Island there were not only the inheritance of the dragons, but also the young dragons that were left there during the war. Now that the dragons had been hit hard, to maintain the survival of the clan, returning to Dragon Island was the first thing to do. Brando, the little female dragon, let out a whimper and bumped into his doubts, causing Brando to roll his eyes and almost fall back into the sea. Alaz looked up with tears in her eyes and blinked her golden eyes. Brando, you must wait for us. When everything is done, I will come with Flora to find you. Flora could not help but frown. However, she still nodded slightly to Brando. She understood that if it were not for this human, she and Alaz would not be standing here in one piece, and the dragons would have suffered even greater losses. However, when she thought of her earrings that had fallen into the hands of this human, she felt a little confused. "Mr. Brando," Flora said, her voice was very soft and pleasant, "Allah's temper has always been like this, you don't have to take it to heart, we are very grateful for your help." After saying that, she bowed to everyone present and said with an apologetic tone, "I'm also very sorry, everyone. I've brought misfortune and disaster to you and my fellow clansmen. When I return from Dragon Island, I'll definitely do my best to make up for my mistakes." "Don't be like this, Miss Flora," Magadol comforted her. "In fact, all of us know that it was not your intention, you were just being manipulated by the Twilight Dragon. Now that you have recovered, we are only happy." Fu Luofa nodded. Fortunately, Feng Qi put his hands behind his head and said with a cold joke, "At least you don't have to repent in front of Lord Bahamut, because even the Dragon God has betrayed the Twilight Dragon." Feng Qi. Phoenix Hua jabbed him with the hilt of her sword. "What?" Feng Qi said with some grievance. "I didn't say anything wrong. Besides, Miss Flora is a dragon, you can't be so weak, right?" "Nothing good comes out of a dog's mouth." Phoenix Hua glared at him and said. "Miss Phoenix Hua, Mr. Feng Qi, stop arguing. Mr. Feng Qi is right, the dragons are the warriors of the gods, this setback is nothing. In the past wars we have also suffered heavy losses." Flora interrupted them. Her expression was very calm, it was obvious that she had already known about the drastic changes in the dragon race. However, the girl's slightly pale face reflected her inner thoughts, she was obviously not as calm as expected. The dragons had suffered heavy losses in previous wars, but this time they had lost their god. "Miss Flora." Phoenix was said worriedly, she subconsciously looked at her teacher. Brando felt something and also looked at Flora. Because of Alaz, he had a misunderstanding with this girl. In fact, he still felt a little awkward and did not know how to get along with her. However, Fu Luofa was very calm. She calmly accepted his gaze. "Do you plan to return to Dragon Island to control Bahamut's temple?" Brando asked. Flora's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise. Bahamut's temple was the center of Dragon Island. She had to settle the dragon's inheritance and the dragon's descendants before the dragon god arrived there. If necessary, she had to give up Dragon Island and find another place to stay. And in the Battle of Metz, although the dragon clan had suffered heavy losses, she believed that there were still many of her kind that had survived. She had to gather these people. In this war, this world still needed the strength of the Golden Clan. She nodded. "Flora," Brando thought for a moment and said, "we all know the meaning of the upcoming war for the world. I don't want to say much, but I have some suggestions." "Please, Mr. Brando. I think what we are facing now is not a war that can be won by fighting alone. Even if we unite all the forces of Wond, it is still weak in front of this powerful opponent. Therefore we cannot divide our forces. Now there are rumors that the Fanzin, Crews and the Wind Elves are having a negotiation. If this negotiation really exists, then it must be that the Fanzin, Crews and the Wind Elves have realized something. And before we go to the Stagnation Realm, in fact, the undead of Madara, their supreme, Her Majesty, almost gave us the same suggestion. She hoped to convey a kind of goodwill to the world through Erwin. Now the undead have divided into two groups and passed through the Gulf of Tabanya and the mountains of Buchi. But not to attack Saint Tothol and Erwin, but to stand with the world of order and face this war together. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.